You know that feeling? The wind starts as just this whisper, and then, without any warning, it just turns. 1 minute, the trail under your feet is just a little damp, and the next, it's a slick, muddy ribbon. A cold rain starts coming down, and you can feel it seeping through every single seam of your gear. You pull off a glove just to check the map on your phone, and bam, you feel how fast your body starts losing heat, just from that wet air hitting your skin. You check your pocket for that waterproof matchbook, and it's just soft, useless pulp. And your phone? Of course, no signal. The nearest road is so far away you can't even hear a hint of traffic. You are, officially, on your own out here. Now, I want you to imagine something else. Picture a winter camp, maybe near one of the northern Great Lakes, but 200 years ago. There's snow packed high around the trunks of the pine trees. It's first light, barely dawn, and a family is breaking camp. The fire they're lifting from last night, it isn't a big flame. It's a single, living coal, wrapped carefully in a bundle of bark and fiber. They're carrying it like it's a small, precious heartbeat. They pack up and they walk straight into that wind, and they're not terrified of the next storm. Why? Because they know the fire is already with them. If you can learn how they kept that one single coal alive, if you can learn how they could coax a flame from soaking wet wood with calm, steady hands, then a day like the one we just imagined, it stops being a crisis. It becomes a test. And it's a test you are absolutely ready to pass. Welcome to the channel. Today, we're not just talking about survival skills, we're talking about a fundamental shift in mindset. Because the first skill you really need to learn, it's not how to light a fire. The first skill is to decide when a fire is non-negotiable, and then to make that fire an absolute certainty. Across the entire continent, from the cedar-soaked coasts of the Pacific Northwest all the way to the willow flats around desert rivers, native communities treated fire as a traveling companion. It was part of the kit. Ethnographers, folks who study and write about human cultures, recorded stories of families who would set out at dawn, and they'd be carrying a smouldering ember from the night before. They'd have it nestled in a cup made of punky wood, that soft, partially decayed wood, or maybe rolled up in a sheath of bark, insulated from the open air with a bit of ash, and then tucked safely inside a pouch. Why go to all that trouble? Because making a brand new flame when you're soaked, you're exhausted, and the rain is pouring down, that just wastes precious strength. Keeping a coal alive removes chance from the equation. It makes fire a guarantee. Now, you can absolutely do the same thing today with modern materials. You can carry a ferro rod, a lighter, a stormproof match. But learning the old method, that builds a kind of judgment that lasts a whole lot longer than a disposable lighter. And that judgment? It starts before the storm. Long before. A person who plans to move quickly, a person who values their energy, pays attention to tinder while the sun is still up. This is step one. When things are good, you're already preparing for when they won't be. So, what are we talking about? Let's look at the materials. The inside of cedar bark, for instance. You can peel it away in these long, beautiful fibers. Just work it between your thumb and your palm, and it separates into this incredibly fine, fluffy mass. Cottonwood bark does the exact same thing, but you've got to let it dry out first. And then there's the rock star of tinders, birch bark. It curls up into these paper-thin sheets that will catch a spark even when the surface of the bark is damp. Why? Because it's packed with natural oils that resist water. It's basically nature's fire starter. You go to a different landscape, you find different materials. Look at cattail heads. When they go to seed, they shed that familiar downy fluff. That stuff will flash with just the briefest glow from an ember. Milkweed floss from inside the pods? Same deal. It'll catch the absolute slightest spark. These materials, they pop up in totally different landscapes, right? From wetlands to dry forests. But the principle behind them is exactly the same. Gather fine, dry, fluffy fibers when you do not need them, and then you keep them somewhere they won't get compacted into a dense, dead felt. Shove a good bundle into a dry pocket or a small pouch. When the night turns, or the weather shifts on you, that tinder is ready. That's the first preparation. But there's a second preparation, and this one, it looks like patience, but really, it's all about speed. Think about a dead branch you find on the ground after a rain. The surface is soaked, right? But the heartwood, the wood at the very center of that branch, is almost always drier than the surface. The bark protects it, and the outer growth soaks up all that recent rain. Your job is to get to that dry center. This is where good knife skills come in. You're not trying to chop the stick in half. You want to split it. Get that stick open and reveal the dry heartwood. Then, you take your knife and you start slicing along the grain, not across it. You're carving thin curls. You might have heard these called feather shavings or a feather stick. The blade just lifts and turns in this steady, hypnotic rhythm. Each one of those little curls holds a tiny pocket of air. And air is what turns a dark, smouldering coal into a breathing, living flame. Here's the trick. You want to make a handful of these feather shavings. Make an amount that looks totally extravagant when you've got time, when the sun is shining and your hands are warm. Why? Because later, when your hands are shaking and the cold wind is ripping at you, you don't have to make them perfect to make them work. You'll have a big, generous pile ready to go. So, now you've got your tinder bundle prepped, and you've got your feather shavings ready. The next question is, where do you borrow the heat from? For thousands of years, many nations used friction fire. Why? Because all it asks for is wood, some fiber, and your own nerve. When your lighter is dead and your matches are wet, the forest itself is your matchbook. There are two main methods we hear about, the hand drill and the bow drill. Both of them do the same thing. They convert your steady motion into intense heat right at the point of contact. In the 19th century, observers recorded people using the hand drill all across the Great Basin, the Southwest, and the plains. The bow drill? Records show that popping up everywhere from the high Arctic all the way down to the eastern woodlands. Our purpose here isn't to catalogue every single variation. It's to show you the spine of the method, the core principle, and why it remains so incredibly useful when all our modern tools fail. Let's start with the hand drill. This method uses a thin, straight spindle. Think of it like a long, straight stick and a flat board, the hearth board, that has a small notch carved into it. What kind of wood? Well, people used what they had. Willow, mule fat, yucca, and sage stems have all been recorded as great spindles. And for the hearth boards? Cottonwood, willow, and aspen were common. The physics here are actually really simple. You apply pressure and speed. That friction raises the temperature right at the contact point until the plant tissue literally changes. It breaks down into this dark, fine powder that eventually, hopefully, begins to glow. The practice? Yeah, that is not simple. Here's how it works. You place your dry tinder bundle right next to that notch in the hearth board, and you put a leaf or a thin sliver of bark under the notch. This is your ember catcher. It's there to catch all that hot dust you're about to make. Then, You take the spindle between your palms. Your hands roll the spindle down, and then you bring them back up and roll it down again. Each pass gets longer and faster than the last. You're leaning your body weight into it, keeping that pressure even. Smoke starts to rise. That's a good sign. The dust in the notch gets deeper and darker. This is the moment of truth. You don't panic. You don't stop. You increase your speed for one short, final burst. Then you lift the spindle clear. You look down into that pile of black dust. And if you see a tiny, persistent red star, a single glowing ember, you've done it. Now, you feed it. You give it breath. But it has to be a steady breath, not a harsh one. If you blow too hard, you'll just scatter all that precious hot dust. You just breathe. The spark becomes a full-blown ember. You carefully, gently, transfer that ember into your tinder bundle. Your hands become a little shelter, cupping around it, protecting it from the wind. And you breathe again, patient and rhythmic, until that whole bundle just leaps into a flame that answers your breath with its own. Now, the bow drill. This changes the game. It adds leverage and it seriously reduces the strain on your hands. You're no longer limited by how fast you can rub your palms together. For this, you need a bow. Any resilient, slightly springy piece of wood will do. You need a cord for that bow. Historically, this was rawhide or cordage twisted from plant fibers like dogbane or milkweed. Today, a paracord shoelace works just fine. The spindle for a bow drill is thicker than the hand drill spindle, and you need one more piece, a socket for the top. This is just something to hold the top of the spindle while it spins, applying downward pressure. In the past, this was a piece of bone, a smooth stone, or a block of hardwood with a small depression carved into it. Today, a smooth pebble or a pre-carved wooden block works perfectly. Here's the setup. The cord of the bow gets wrapped once around the spindle. You put the bottom of the spindle into that small depression on your hearthboard, the same kind of board you used for the hand drill. You put the socket on top of the spindle and you apply pressure. Then you move the bow back and forth, like you're sawing a log. The spindle spins fast. Just like before, that friction creates hot dust, which gathers in the notch of the hearthboard. And just like before, you'll see smoke. You keep going, steady and smooth. You're listening to the sound, feeling the grit. When you're sure you have a good pile of black dust, you lift the spindle and you look for that same beautiful red ember. Again, people used what they had. Some communities loved using spruce roots for their cordage. Others twisted fibers from plants. If you're a modern hiker learning this old pattern, sure, you can use paracord. But it is so valuable to practice with plant-based cordage at least once. It teaches you exactly how much tension is enough and how much is too much, right before it snaps. Now, there's a bit of a disagreement in the historical record. How often did families really rely on friction fire versus just carrying their fire with them day after day? One position holds that friction methods were a regular, normal part of daily life. The materials were everywhere, the knowledge was widespread, so why not? Another position argues that, while friction fire was known and it was taught, you've got to have a backup plan, right? The preferred strategy, the A plan, was always to guard your coals and transport them. You'd only resort to the hard work of friction fire when you absolutely had to. But here's the thing. These two positions don't actually cancel each other out. They both describe the same core philosophy, a habit of removing chance. If you can keep a coal, you keep it. It's smart, it's efficient. If you must make a new flame, you know how. Both are about certainty, and that coal, the ember itself. It was more than just a step on the way to a bigger flame. It was a safe, portable store of heat that you could carry across miles and miles. How did they do it? Many accounts describe using punk wood. That's the soft, decayed, almost spongy heartwood of a dead log. It's perfect because it doesn't really burst into flame. It just holds a hot, smouldering ember for a very, very long time. Other records, especially from the northern forests, mention using fungus. Certain types of fungus that grow on birch or beech trees, for example, produce this dense, felted layer. It's called amadou, or tinder fungus, that is just unbelievably good at catching and holding a spark. There's debate, of course, about which exact species were used the most, and whether trade, like the fur trade, spread the use of the best tinder fungi far and wide, or if people just stuck to what grew locally. One position reads the record as evidence of strong, super-regional practices. Another sees that fur trade era as a time when these high-quality materials moved along the same routes as iron kettles and woven cloth. But for you, caught in a storm, what matters isn't the Latin name of the species. What matters is the habit. You can make your own coal keeper. Carve a small cup from a chunk of soft, punky wood. Fill it with a little pinch of white ash from a cold fire pit. The ash acts as an insulator and slows down the burn. Place your glowing ember right in the center. Add a little more ash on top. Then, you can wrap that whole thing in a roll of bark or a piece of cloth, leaving just a tiny bit of space for air to reach it. You check it at intervals. You feed it with just a tiny touch of dry tinder dust if it starts to dull. And with that, you can walk for hours with a tiny furnace, a little bit of heat that's just waiting for you. You know, we should pause on cedar bark for a minute, because it teaches 3 lessons all at once, all in one plant. Lesson 1. The inner bark fibers, when you work them by hand, become that fluffy tinder bundle that accepts a spark in an instant. Lesson 2. The bark itself, in flat, rigid strips, becomes a perfect sheath for carrying a coal. Lesson 3. The tree also yields resin, and that resin is a game changer in damp weather. If you find a little lump of pine, spruce, or cedar resin, that sticky sap that hardens on the bark, you've got a fire accelerator. Warm a small lump near a flame. Don't put it in the flame. It'll just flare up. When it gets soft, drip it onto your tinder bundle or your feather shavings. That resin gives you a slow, persistent, hot source of heat that perfectly bridges the gap, that critical moment between your tiny ember and a stable, established fire. Birch bark does this too. It basically has its own oils built right in, acting as a natural accelerator. When your modern matches have failed you, when your lighter is just clicking uselessly, and these properties, they stop being about bushcraft or novelty. They become about survival. Okay, so you've got your tinder, you've got your ember, and you've got a small flame. Now what? The structure of your fire matters. A lot of beginners, they think a huge roaring blaze means success. But the historical record, and honestly just plain old common sense, shows a totally different pattern. Small, controlled fires are better. They conserve your precious fuel. And if you're in a situation where you don't want to be seen, they reduce the smoke that would reveal your camp. You lay the base of the fire off the cold, wet ground. Use a platform of dry, dead sticks. This keeps your newborn flame from getting smothered by damp soil. Your kindling is graded. You start with your tinder, then your finest, thinnest shavings, then pencil-thin twigs, then finger-thick sticks, and so on. You don't leave any big gaps that would cause your little flame to collapse on itself. A small, reflective wall of green logs, you don't want them to catch fire, can be placed on one side of your fire to throw the heat back toward you without you having to use any more fuel. A simple windbreak, made from your pack or a sheet of bark, can shelter the fire during its critical first few minutes. This whole process, this is craft. It's not bravado. It's not a magic trick. The craft comes from repeating these quiet, simple steps until they are just normal. If you're lost in a storm, your mind drifts toward panic. Why? Because panic feels like action, but the habit of fire, the craft of it removes that urge. You stop panicking, and you start thinking in sequences. Because before there were gas stoves and central heating, families thought in these exact same sequences every single morning and every single night. Let's take a modern scene. You're on the lee side of a ridge. The rain is slanting in sheets. Your gloves are soaked. You keep your knife in its sheath, because you know that cutting with cold, numb hands is how accidents happen. You don't look for wood on the ground. You look up. You break dead branches from the undersides of conifer trees, the pines and the firs. Why? Because their dense needles act like a little umbrella, shedding the water and keeping the wood underneath them drier. You find a wrist-thick branch. You snap it against your knee and twist it to reveal that dry heartwood inside. You place that dry heart on a flat stone you've found, and you start carving your feather shavings. You reach into a dry pocket, and you pull out that handful of fine, fluffy cedar fibers that you gathered yesterday when the sun was shining. You build a small platform of dry twigs on a patch of ground you've scraped bare with your boot. Your lighter sparks, but the flame is weak and sputtering in the wind. You don't give up. You remember that little pea-sized lump of resin you found in a bark scar earlier. You drip it onto the shavings. Your flame survives its first battle. It catches. Why? Because you didn't wait until the last minute to think about tinder, and because you're carrying a habit, not just a product. There's a related method, a different kind of habit, that really matters when you can't light a full flame right at that moment, but you know you'll need the security of heat later. This is the concept of the coal train. Here's how it works. Once you do have a stable, established fire, you don't just let it all burn to white ash. You create a small, dense core of slow-burning coals. You can do this by letting pieces of that punky wood, or a thick, tightly rolled up piece of bark, burn down until they're glowing red, and then you pull them out of the main fire before they ash out. You take one of these glowing embers, and you set it into your carrier, that little cup of punky wood or that bark roll we talked about. You give it that buffer of insulating ash. You let it rest. You let it breathe. Just a little. You check it. And then, at your next rest stop, maybe an hour down the trail, you open up the roll. You let the air in. And if the ember is looking a little dull, you add a tiny crumb of that dry, black dust from your hearthboard notch, or a pinch of your fine tinder. You give it a gentle breath. You're not making a fire. You're just feeding the spark. The person who walks with a coal is a person who walks with time. They're not on a desperate clock. They're carrying a guarantee. Now, friction fire and coal keeping. These skills do a lot more than just warm your hands or dry your socks. They protect your water. And in any survival situation, water is everything. Water that's been made safe to drink through heat is what keeps your body steady, what keeps your mind clear, especially as the days stretch on and the situation changes. We see accounts of this all over, from the Pacific Northwest to the Great Lakes. People were boiling water in containers that, well, you could never put them directly into a flame. Think about it. A basket, even one woven tightly and lined with pitch, or a simple bowl made of birch bark. You stick that in a fire and you've got a hole. So, how did they do it? They used stone boiling. They would heat stones clean, hard stones in the coals of their fire. Then, using tongs made from a split piece of greenwood, they'd lift those hot stones and move them into the water container. The practice itself requires this really calm, specific attention to detail. First, the stones have to be the right kind. You need granite, or some other hard, dense, non-porous rock. You cannot use soft, waterlogged stones from the riverbed, or layered, flaky rocks like shale. Why? Because any moisture trapped inside that stone will turn to steam and explode. It can throw sharp shards of rock right at your face. So, you use hard, dry stones. Second, you have to heat them slowly, at the edge of the coals, not in the raging center of the flame. This, again, avoids a steam explosion. Third, before they go into your water, you have to wipe them clean of ash. Nobody wants to drink a gritty, ashy soup. You do all that. You lift the first clean, hot stone. You lower it into your bark bowl of cold water. And poos! The hiss and churn begins. The water immediately starts to steam. And just like that, what seemed like a weak, fragile container has just become your kettle. Now, like with everything, there's some disagreement about how widely stone boiling was used beyond just cooking. One position argues it was primarily for stews and soups. And this makes total sense, right? That intense, rolling heat is perfect for driving all the nutrients out of bones and tough roots, getting all that goodness into the broth. But another position notes that people absolutely boiled water just for safety when a surface source was suspect, maybe after a flood stirred everything up. And they did it for convenience. You can heat a few stones with just a tiny, fuel-efficient fire, without needing some big, complicated setup to suspend a heavy pot over a blaze. And honestly, you can accept both of these positions without any strain. They're both right. If you're out there, and you're in a place where you just do not trust the water from a stream, you can make a bowl from a piece of folded bark. You can even shape a depression in a bank of clay. You heat your clean stones at the edge of your fire. You drop them in. You raise the temperature of that water until it's at a good rolling boil. You don't need a high-tech metal pot to protect yourself from waterborne illness. You just need knowledge. You just need a habit. Let me tell you a little story. It's a small one, but it helps bring all of this out of theory and into memory. Picture a family. They're traveling cross-country, on foot. It's the mid-19th century. They're moving with the season, following a known route of camps along a river. It's late afternoon. The sky at the edge of the world turns this bruised, blackish blue, and the wind, it picks up, and it smells like the big lake, that cold, damp smell. The eldest daughter, she's the one carrying the ember pouch. The mother, she's not panicking, she's just working. She's gathering strips of bark that she knows will curl and catch a spark. The father, he sets 2 small sticks on the ground to make a dry platform for the first feather shavings, tucking it all under a little rock overhang. And the youngest boy, he's just watching. He's watching the way his sister shades that ember pouch with her cupped hands, as if she's keeping a tiny, glowing secret from the rain. They're not shouting, they're not running around, they hardly even speak. The choices they're making, they're old choices. They're not dramatic, they're just the steps. 10 minutes later, there's tea. Steam is rising in that damp grey light. None of them, not one, thinks they've just performed some amazing trick. They've just moved through the only steps that make any sense. Now, let's translate that exact same logic to a present-day morning. Your camp. It just bursts into rain, right as you're hoping to make that first cup of coffee. The ground is a sponge. The sky is just squeezing itself out. You remember that last night, before bed, you pulled a strip of bark from a dead cedar. You remember working its inner fibers between your hands until they looked like the fine, fluffy tail of a horse. You remember tucking that dry bundle into the breast pocket of your jacket. You also remember that you collected a few chunks of fatwood from an old pine stump where lightning had struck years before. Fatwood, by the way, is that super resinous heartwood that remains when the outer wood rots away. It's nature's perfect kindling, and it lights with a steady, oily flame even when it's wet. So, in the rain, you find a dry stick. You split it. You raise those fine, thin curls for a nest. You cup your body around the work, creating a little pocket of calm, so the wind just eddies around you, but it doesn't rip through your little project. You're lighter. It fails on the first flick. Of course it does. But on the second, it catches. A tiny flame touches the fatwood. The resinous fatwood touches the curls. The curls touch the finger-thick sticks you've laid on your little platform. And just like that, the line between frustration and relief, it's crossed. It's crossed with one patient, logical chain of steps. See, the lesson here, it's not that you have to reject modern tools. That's ridiculous. Lighters are amazing. The lesson is that thoughtful redundancy is a virtue. The families who had no steel, they carried heat. The families who had steel knives, they still gathered tinder when it was sunny. The people who had iron kettles, they still boiled with stones when it suited their camp. When you carry a small piece of char cloth in a little tin, or you tuck a wrapped lump of resin in your pack, you're honoring that exact same logic. You are trading a tiny bit of your time, when time is easy, for a whole lot of security when it is not. Okay, there is one more part of this whole firecraft thing that looks so simple, but it actually reveals a ton of judgment, and that is knowing when to stop, knowing what good enough looks like. Wet clothing and cold wind, they rob you of heat with a speed that, honestly, it just surprises people who haven't really experienced it. It's terrifying. A small fire, it's a tool. It can dry your socks and gloves if you hold them at the right distance and you rotate them with care. You get too close, that wool singes, or worse, your fancy synthetics just melt and they harden into this useless, crusty thing. A simple stick pressed into the wet ground makes a perfect little rack for your gloves. A stake planted near the coals can hold a sock, so the broadside faces the heat, and just the slightest adjustment of the angle can change the drying time. The record shows countless quiet, simple acts like this. A line of fish hung on forked twigs, turned by pure habit. A set of birch bark containers set near the coals, just until the pitch softens and seals a seam. None of this requires force. It doesn't require a giant, raging fire. It requires attention. And that attention is what multiplies the value of your small, efficient flame. Fire also shapes the space where you sleep. This is huge. A long fire, one that's built parallel to where your body's going to be, parallel to your bed of boughs, it radiates its warmth along the full length of your person. It's so much more efficient than a round fire, where you're either roasting your shins or your back is freezing. You add that reflective wall of logs, or even just a banked-up snow edge on the far side. All that heat gets returned right back to you. Many communities in the northern forests, this was the default for travel days. The pattern took barely any more fuel than a round fire, and it offered this incredibly even, luxurious warmth. If you try this, you will feel the difference in minutes. You combine that with a habit of, say, drying one set of socks at night while you're wearing your other dry pair, and airing out your boots near the flame, but not on it. Your morning just begins. Better. It begins without that dull, miserable shock of putting cold feet into damp boots. Of course, not all wood gives you the same kind of fire. This is a whole library of knowledge in itself. Hardwoods, your oaks, your maples, your hickory, their coals, hold heat for a long time. They're what you want for a cooking fire or that long fire for sleeping. Soft woods, especially the ones with resin like pine and fir, they give you flame more quickly. They're your get-the-fire-started wood. The old practice was, you use what grows in your region, and you have a crystal-clear idea of its behavior. You know it. Birch bark starts the fire. Birchwood coals last. Aspen. It's easy to cut and split, but it produces this light, fluffy ash that just drifts and chokes everything if you don't manage it. Oak. It burns hotter and longer than almost anything when it's seasoned. But it's a beast to try and gather and process if you're in a hurry. Pine makes this lively, crackling fire, but it throws sparks. Sparks that will bite little holes in your expensive jacket if you sit too close. You memorize these traits just after a few days of practice. But here's the thing. Most people today, they don't practice. Why would they? The grocery store and the thermostat, they hide the consequences of forgetting. They make this knowledge feel optional. But if you spend just a few evenings in safe conditions, maybe in your backyard, working a bow drill or just cutting feather shavings, you attach sensory memory to these names. Your muscle knows the pull of the fibers. Your ear knows the sound of a spindle that's too dry or too damp. Your nose knows when the wood is ready, when that dust is about to glow. And look, if you can't legally gather wood where you live, you can still learn so much of this. You can do this in a backyard or in a park with permission. You can peel a strip of bark from stormfall, a branch that's already down. You're not cutting live trees. You can work that bark into tinder. You can roll up that tinder bundle, keep it in a bag for a month, and then see if it still accepts a spark. You can collect a small piece of resin from a fallen branch without harming the tree. These are not games. Not if you treat them with seriousness. They are building a habit. And that habit, on a day of cold rain and deep fatigue, it feels like calm. I know some viewers, you're probably expecting a list of top 5 survival secrets. That is not the shape of reality. What many, many people call a trick. It's just the visible part of a much wider, deeper way of preparing. That coal, carried in a pouch, that's not a novelty. That is the end of a sequence that began yesterday evening, when someone had the judgment to choose one piece of punk wood over another. That hand drill ember, it doesn't arise from some exotic, magical material. It arises from consistent form and a persistence that doesn't yield at the first ache in your shoulders. That little piece of resin that saves your weak flame. It didn't just fall into your pocket by accident. It was noticed, and it was kept. If you're going to emulate anything from this, emulate that. That habit of noticing and keeping and preparing. And a final note, for now, about safety and respect. This is non-negotiable. Practice friction fire and coal keeping in places where you will not start an uncontrolled burn. Use a fire pan or a designated fire ring where regulations require it. And when you are done, drown your coals. Stir them. Drown them again. Make sure they are cold dead out. Many communities, as we've talked about, used fire across landscapes to care for plants and animals. That is a much larger subject, with its own history and laws. For today, take only the part that belongs to you, which is to learn how to sustain yourself without carelessness. The record is clear. People took care of the places they lived. You can do the same where you walk. So, the storm that began this story. It's past. The trail is steaming. A little strip of blue sky is opening up between the clouds. You empty your pockets just to check what you have. There's that bundle of cedar you once might have thought of as just scrap. Now it's fluffed, and it's back in its dry pouch. There's that sliver of resin wrapped in a leaf, and in that small roll of bark, there are a few charred crumbs that you can feel it. They still hold a faint, residual warmth, now that the wind has dropped. You fold them away. Nothing about your pack looks any different to someone else. But everything about your likelihood of getting through the next cold evening has changed. The old method. It lives where it has always lived. In the steady hands of people who choose to prepare when it is easy, so that they're ready later when it is not. A coal the size of a seed can keep a person the size of you alive. But that heat matters most when you can hold it. Fire gives you the spark, and it gives you the coals. But shelter is the vessel. Shelter is the container that keeps all that precious heat near your skin and near your breath. People all across this continent treated shelter as a moving craft, not as a fixed, permanent structure. It wasn't about building a house in miniature. It was a short project, done well, and done often. And it was always tuned to the specific wind, the slope, and the season. When you understand that pattern, you start carrying an invisible roof around in your mind, and you can build it with whatever a place offers you. A day of building shelter. It always begins with where to stop, just choosing your site. That is the first wall you build, and it's the most important one. Think about it. Cold air. It's heavy. It settles in low ground. It pulls, just like water, into shallow bowls and valleys. You don't want to sleep there. Wind. It speeds up when it goes over ridges, and it blasts through the mouths of passes. You don't want to be there either. And you look up. You see those widowmakers, those dead limbs hanging high up in the canopy. You don't camp under those, because a big storm gust is just going to lift them and drop them. So, where is the good spot? You're looking for a slight rise, just a little bit of high ground, under the trees, and ideally on the lee side of a hill. That's the side that's protected from the wind. This spot gives you drainage, so you're not sleeping in a puddle. It gives you a break from that main wind, but it keeps you out of the worst gusts that are scouring the crest of the ridge. You might want to camp near water for convenience, but you don't camp on the sand right next to it. That sand will just wick your body heat away all night long. People who moved by foot or canoe They were looking for these exact same features. They knew that a poor site choice just multiplies the work of every single stick you have to cut, and every bundle of boughs you have to lay. Okay, so you've found your spot. What do you build? In many forests, the best and fastest answer is a classic lean-to shelter paired with a long fire. You see descriptions of this everywhere in the accounts from the northern woodlands. Travelers would cut a solid ridgepole, rest it at about shoulder height between two sturdy trees. Then they'd lean a fan of ribs, smaller poles against that main ridgepole, and then they'd cover that whole frame with boughs and bark, layered like shingles, so the roof sheds the rain and, just as importantly, catches the heat from your fire. The angle of that roof matters more than almost anything. If it's too shallow, it's just going to hold water and drip on you all night. If it's too steep, it wastes space, and it actually sheds the heat up and away from you. But when you get that angle just right, the face of that shelter acts like a parabolic mirror. It reflects the warmth from your long fire right back down toward your bed, like it's another fire, but without any flame. In wet country, you can lay a layer of bark over your bough roof, and it turns all those little drips into sheets that just fall harmlessly behind your bed. In dry, cold country, a thick, fluffy thatch of evergreen branches does the same thing. And remember that row of logs we talked about on the far side of your fire? That returns even more heat toward you. None of this, not one bit of it, asks for rare materials. It just asks for your attention. It asks you to pay attention to the way warmth moves in the air. Now, we've got to talk about the bed, because the bed matters just as much as the roof. The ground is a heat thief. It will steal your warmth by direct contact, conduction, and by any dampness, evaporation. A mattress of boughs, that is what breaks that contact. The old phrase is, you build it the thickness of your hand, and then you build it the thickness of your hand again. You keep layering until you can press your full weight down and you feel this springy, soft cushion instead of the hard, cold soil. If you're in a place where evergreens are scarce, dry grass works. Big slabs of bark work too, if you lay them with a little air gap underneath. People in the north, they spoke of spruce boughs all the time. Why? Because spruce holds its needles well, and its branches are easy to cut and lay into these flat, comfortable fans. Pine works, but the branches are stiffer, the needles are longer. It's a bit pokier. Cedar is fantastic. It's soft, and it smells great. So is fir. But if you sleep on bare ground, I don't care how big your fire is, the cold will just climb into your bones, and you will wake up feeling like you've been quietly robbed all night. But if you lie on a good bed with just a small, efficient fire and a little roof, you've made a space that feels like competence, not luck. That's one answer. But what if you can't safely tend a fire? What if it's a driving, relentless rain that would just turn any flame into smoke? You need a different answer, and that is the debris shelter. A debris shelter is basically a small, human-sized room that you make out of leaves and sticks and whatever forest stuff is lying around. You're building a cocoon. The spine of it is a single, long ridgepole, long enough to cover you from your head to well beyond your feet. One end rests on the ground, and the other end rests on a Y-shaped fork you found, or on a stump, or a low-hanging branch. Then, you lean ribs, smaller sticks from both sides of that pole, meeting at the top to form this low, tight A-frame. And then, the work begins. You just pile leaves and grass and pine duff and all the forest stuff you can find until the walls are thick. I mean really thick. So thick that if you thrust your hand into the side, your hand just meets layers of debris, not empty air. A foot thick. 2 feet thick. 3 feet thick is not too much. You're building insulation. You make a human-sized door plug out of a bundle of debris, and you pull it in after you crawl inside. There is nothing dramatic about this shelter. It's not pretty, but done right. It smells like rich earth, and it feels like a cocoon. It's trapping your own body heat. In the East, people who lived among all those hardwood forests, they had leaves in almost unbelievable quantities. They could build a shelter like this fast. In the West, brush and grasses take the place of leaves. But in both places, the principle is the same. You are not building a house. You are building a thick coat that you can step into. Now, let's go to a different landscape. Open country, windy country. A dome of brush, known in many places as a wiki-up or a brush lodge, that solves a wind problem much better than a flat-walled lean-to. For this, you take saplings of flexible wood, like willow or young poles. You push the thick ends into the soil in a circle, and then you bend them all toward the center. You lash them at the top, using cordage you've made from bark or roots or yucca fiber. You can add more arches in between to act as ribs. The whole frame takes on the strength of a basket. It's incredibly strong. Then you clothe it. You thatch it with brush or bark or, in some places, with woven mats. Among Apache-related groups, shelters like this went up fast. They vented well in the dry desert heat, but they still cut that cold desert wind at night. Among the Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone peoples, domes made of willow and thatched with sagebrush or rabbit brush, they met the exact same needs out on those open flats. And, of course, there's disagreement. Did people build fires inside these brush shelters as a daily habit? Or did they light their fires outside to reduce the risk of an ember catching that dry thatch? One position says, yeah, an interior hearth was common. You just leave a smoke hole at the peak, maybe managed by a twist of brush you can move. The other position holds that, with lighter, fluffier thatch. It was just safer and smarter to have your fire outside, maybe with its own little windbreak. Either way, the form teaches the principle. A low, rounded shape wastes very little material, and it resists a gust of wind that would just pry a flat wall apart. And that brings us to the mats. A mat, however. A mat dances with rain in a way that a cleaner, more finished surface than a pile of brush can ever give. Let's talk about cattails and tulle. These are plants that grow in marshes, in long, slow-moving water. Their leaves dry into these long, tough, flexible ribbons. And these ribbons can be woven into mats almost as wide as a person is tall. California groups and families in the Great Basin would weave these mats and then just roll them up for travel. The frame for their shelter would again be those bent saplings, or maybe a light tripod of poles and rafters. Then, they would tie these mats onto the frame in overlapping rows, just like shingles on a house. And they would shed water perfectly, down and away. This is a complete game changer. A person who knows how to make a mat is a person who carries their walls and their roof as a skill instead of as a dead weight. So how do you make one? The weaving is beautiful in its simplicity. You just lay a line of stalks parallel to each other. Then you take another strip and you lace it crosswise. Over one, under the next, over one, under the next. You pull it snug. The friction of the plant fibers locks them together. A mat like this. You can hoist it as easily as a modern tarp. But unlike a plastic tarp, it breathes. It dries out without getting covered in mildew. If you're ever near a patch of reeds or cattails today, you can make a small one, just for practice. You'll feel how quickly a solid wall can grow right out of the plants. Moving on, let's talk about bark shelters. In the eastern forests, this was how you turned a tree into a roof. Birch bark is the famous one, and for good reason. It's incredibly strong, it's lightweight, and it's saturated with those natural oils that make it waterproof. But spruce and elm bark also work. They form large, thick sheets, especially when they're peeled in the right season. Families in the northeast would set frames of saplings, and they'd tie them together with roots. Then, they would literally sew the bark sheets onto that frame, like shingles, using more roots as the thread. The result was a roof that could last a whole season, or even a year, depending on the thickness and the care they took. Birch bark can be curled into cylinders and set vertically, or it can be laid as curved shingles, with all the seams overlapped. Now, the record disagrees on this. To what extent were these full wigwams, these bark lodges, portable? One view holds that in river regions, sure, the frames and the bark could be reused. You just load them into a canoe and move them to the next camp. Another view argues that the frames were more often just rebuilt at the new camp. It was easier than hauling them. The bark, once it had been stitched together for a season, mostly just stayed in place until it wore out. But both views agree on the method. You'd split spruce roots into these flat, strong ribbons to use as sewing thread. You'd punch holes, not tear them. And you'd cork the seams with a little bit of resin or moss to make them watertight. If you're a modern traveler and you don't have a canoe, you can still borrow the part that helps you today. And that is the shingle logic. Any sheet, a piece of bark, a mat, even a modern poncho, any sheet that sheds water down and away, overlapped so that wind cannot press the rain back up through the seam. That becomes a traveler's roof. Just as soon as you tie it to a frame, the landscape changes again. And now, the material you have is snow. Snow is not the enemy, not when you know how to shape it. It becomes your building. This only works when wind and time have packed that snow into firm, solid layers. You can't do this with fresh, fluffy powder. A snow trench is the absolute fastest way to turn the cold, biting air into your insulation. You just dig a slot, no wider than your shoulders, and long enough for your body. You dig it down to a depth where the wind it can't touch you anymore. A roof made of poles, or your skis, or your snowshoes, with a covering of more snow or a tarp, closes off the space. Two things are critical here. One, a breathing vent must stay open. A small hole may be cleared with a ski pole. Two, a sleeping ledge on one side of the trench above the floor. This keeps your body above the coldest air, which will always sink to the lowest point. People in the far north, of course, refined this into an art form. They built block constructions, cutting snow blocks and stacking them in a perfect spiral to form a dome, an igloo. But you do not need a perfect spiral to get the benefit. The principle is what matters. The principle is that still air, trapped in the snow, and snow walls, blocking the wind, keep the heat of your own body from being stripped away. There are records of these block houses being built in just a few hours, and they would stand for weeks. There are also records of simpler trenches that saved lives in a single, brutal storm when no other materials were available. Now, there's a debate. It's a debate among modern instructors. Does a small candle really add useful heat inside a snow shelter? One position says, absolutely. In a small, sealed snow chamber, even that tiny flame raises the temperature in a way you can definitely feel. The other position says the heat gains are pretty modest. The real value is the light and the psychological comfort of having a flame. But while they debate that, the risk of consuming your oxygen without a vent is very, very real. So here's the safe part to adopt: the vent. If you are ever using any flame inside a snow shelter, even just a candle, you must keep a vent clear. You must mind the air. Now, between the pure heat of a fire and the full enclosure of a roof, there's another smart, simple answer, and that is to lift the sleeper off the wet ground, especially when your fire has to do most of the work. Travelers, particularly in the subarctic, often slept on raised beds when a fire was their main source of heat. They'd lay poles across short supports to make a platform, a simple cot that air could move under. Then, they'd build 2 long fires, one on each side. This setup sends warmth to both sides of the body at once. There are accounts among Algonquin-speaking peoples of beds just like this, used on fast journeys when stopping to build a full, enclosed hut would have just cost too much time. There is, as you might guess, some disagreement. How common was this double fire and raised bed setup versus the simpler lean-to and single long fire? One view emphasizes this raised bed as a hallmark of winter travel camps, especially for hunters who were moving fast. Another suggests it was just one of several options, chosen based on personal habit and the local wood supply. Either way, the raised bed teaches 2 things. 1, air moving under a platform helps dry it out. And 2, heat that reaches both sides of your body at once reduces the need to constantly turn and tend the fire all night. This all leads to a bigger idea. Clothing is the shelter you wear. To treat it as something separate from your shelter system is to miss the entire point of how people stayed warm while moving. In the north, fur was oriented with a purpose. The hair would face outward to shed weather, and it would face inward for sleeping, trapping body heat right against the skin. Caribou hide was especially prized. Why? Because the hair is hollow. It traps air, giving it incredible loft and insulation. Seal skin, on the other hand, is a perfect outer layer for shedding wind and wet. In the forests of the interior, deer hide clothing was often smoked. This was a critical step. The smoke would cure the hide, making it resistant to damp. It meant the garment wouldn't dry stiff and hard after being in the rain. People would cut these garments to allow a full range of motion, so you could work without feeling gripped and tight at the shoulders and elbows. Women in the Pacific Northwest made clothing from softened cedar bark fibers. When these fibers were dried and woven, they stayed warm even when that constant coastal mist and spray made wool feel heavy and useless. California groups made skirts and capes from tule reeds or from rabbit skins. They'd sew strips of fur, braid alternating with fur, to create these blankets that flexed and insulated at the same time. In deep winter, some families wore double layers: an inner parka with the fur facing towards the skin, and an outer parka with the fur facing out to the weather. And the moccasins. They were stuffed with dry grass. This wasn't just for padding. That grass was a high-tech liner. It wickeded moisture away from the feet. And at the end of the day, you'd pull out the damp, compressed grass and replace it with a fresh, dry handful for the next morning. If you have ever had to walk out of a storm with wet socks, I'm telling you, A handful of dry grass inside them will protect your feet more than plastic bags, and it won't trap all your sweat. The principle is to carry materials that can be dried and refreshed every single day. Footwear itself is such a quiet, vital part of survival. It is always easier to prevent a blister than to heal one in cold weather. Moccasins were often cut from a single piece of hide with a puckered toe. They fit closely, and they allow a person to feel the ground. You know where your foot is landing. In a wet marsh, you'd see high-top moccasins with leggings tied over them. This kept the mud out and protected your shins. In snow, you'd see overshoes made of fur or thick hide, designed to shed the snow crystals that would otherwise bite into thinner leather. And then there are snowshoes. These are a brilliant piece of technology for spreading your weight over a larger area. Their forms vary dramatically by region, because snow varies by region. Out on the plains and parklands, you'd see long, narrow shoes that tracked straight. In the deep, thick forests, you'd see shorter, wider, bare-paw-style shoes that let you turn more easily. There's a disagreement among historians about this. How early did snowshoes appear, and what routes did they take spreading across the continent? One position holds that they developed in the northeast and then spread west with migrations and trade. Another position points to multiple regions, suggesting the forms arose independently, just as a logical response to local winter conditions. The useful piece for you today is not their origin, but their effect. If you have to move in deep snow without modern gear, even a crude frame, just bent branches with some woven rope, will keep you from post-holing, from sinking up to your hip with every single step. Wind. Wind is a teacher. It speaks in visible ways, if you learn to read its language. Watch the tops of the trees. They'll tell you the general, prevailing direction, but then watch the small grasses. They tell you about the gusts, what's happening right at ground level, which is where you live. Watch your smoke. If it lingers low and it flows steadily in one direction, the night will likely bring colder, stable air. If your smoke rises quickly and then starts to twist, the air is unstable. A front might be near. People set their doorways and their fire openings based on these signs. In the deserts, a simple brush windbreak, just a low wall of sagebrush set perpendicular to the evening wind, makes sleep possible without getting sand in your mouth. In the mountains, a shelter tucked behind a big boulder, out of the line of those prevailing gusts, that saves you from waking up at 2 a.m. to a roof that's just been peeled off in the night. There are journals that record a man finding a wall of woven willow built by women at a camp on a lake in the southwest. It wasn't built to impress visitors. It was set to deflect wind from a hearth and to keep blowing grit out of the food. You can build that same simple wall in minutes, with driftwood and brush, and completely change the quality of your night. But attachment is the thread that holds all of this together. Without cordage, you cannot lash your frames. You can't tie your mats. You can't anchor your roof. Plant fibers make a string that, honestly, it doesn't look strong. Not until you twist it the right way. The reverse wrap is the method. You can learn this in an hour, and you can use it for the rest of your life. You hold 2 small bundles of fibers. You twist each bundle away from you until it wants to kink up on itself. Then you wrap it towards you, over the other bundle. That's it. Twist away, wrap toward. The friction locks the twist. When one bundle starts to thin out, you just lay another little bundle of fibers in, overlapping it, and you keep twisting. You can do this with dogbane, milkweed, nettle, the inner bark of basswood or cedar. yucca leaves, even strips of cloth. People also used roots. Spruce roots, split and smoothed, were used for sewing and lashing. They'd boil the roots to soften them, split them with their teeth or a knife, and then rub them smooth over a stick. A root-sewn seam on a piece of bark. It doesn't cut the bark the way a sharp modern cord might. It bites and it holds. And finally, you need anchors. Anchors are what keep your roof in place when the wind tugs at it. A deadman anchor is a simple, brilliant trick. It's just a stick buried in the ground with your line attached to the middle. In sand or snow, you bury that stick perpendicular to the pole you're anchoring, and you stamp the fill tight. A single stake, that'll just pull right out. But a deadman holds, because it's pulling against the entire mass of earth or snow you just packed on top of it. This trick. It appears in cold regions, where snow loads up a roof, and it appears on coasts, where storms roar through camps. If you're up above the tree line and you can't drive stakes into solid rock, just wrap your line around a stone as big as your head. Set it down as your anchor. These are not modern hacks. This is the quiet, simple logic of people who tied their shelters down on gravel bars and tundra. People who were not going to waste an hour of the next day replacing a roof that blew away in the night. One story really shows how fast all these pieces can combine. Picture a father and a daughter. They're traveling down a chain of northern lakes by canoe. It's getting late in the day. A wind kicks up, and it starts to slap the water into those short, steep, choppy waves. It's time to get off the water. They make shore early, finding a good spot in a stand of spruce trees with a small strip of sand. The work starts instantly. The girl gathers a handful of spruce roots and warms them in hot water from their pot. This makes them pliable, so they'll bend without splitting. The father, meanwhile, chooses 2 young spruce trees that are spaced just right. He sets a ridgepole between them, resting it in a small notch he cuts into each trunk. He leans ribs against that pole. He lays boughs on the ribs, layering them, ribbon and bow, alternating so all the gaps are covered from 2 directions. The girl takes a scrap of birch bark and, using those softened roots, she sews a little shingle right over a seam where water might drip, right near the head of the bed. The father lays the bed. It's a thick bed of boughs, so deep that the fingers of his hand disappear when he presses down. The long fire is built. It's short, efficient, and built parallel to the bed. A line of stones on the far side acts as a heat reflector. They're not going to have a smoky fire. They want to keep their sleeping clothes clean. So they eat broth, which they heated by dropping hot stones right into a bark bowl. The rain arrives. It comes in dark veils, and then it just steers. But inside, they are warm. They sleep. In the morning, the roof is beaded with water, but their bed is bone dry. The spruce roots are still holding tight on the frame. The old fire, the one they'll build now, is just for breakfast. Now, take that same problem and move it. A desert wind asks for totally different work. A walker on a sagebrush flat. They can't find 2 trees to lean a ridgepole against. So, they cut a circle of willow wands. They bend them into arches, pushing the ends deep into the crusted soil. They tie the arches together overhead with cordage they've made from yucca fibers. They set bundles of brush, overlapping, with the edges facing away from the wind, so the gusts can't peel them off. The shelter is low, because low is stable. Inside, they don't have spruce boughs. They lay a bed of dry grass, gathered from the shadows of greasewood trees where moisture lingers after a rare storm. And here's the key. The walker does not light a fire. Fuel is scarce, and a fire would just make them sweat, wasting precious body water. They eat the cold food they carried. They drink carefully, and they let that simple brush dome take the sting out of the wind. In the morning light, the shelter just looks like another part of the hill. The walker pulls it down, scatters the materials, and walks on, leaving almost no mark. Winter. Winter simplifies and complicates things all at once. A traveler on skis or snowshoes, they find a deep drift. They might cut blocks from it, using a saw or just the back of a knife, and stack them into a short wall. A simple windbreak. Or they'll dig down into the lee of that drift until they hit firm snow. They'll carve a bench to sleep on, higher than the trench floor. They'll lay their poles and a tarp across the top for a roof. They hang a small cloth at the entrance to cut drafts. And they always keep a vent open above their head. They build before they are tired. This is a rule that people who live in such conditions have always followed. They build before they are tired. They know that mistakes happen when your fingers get slow, and when your brain, which wanted to race just one more hour, suddenly feels heavy in your skull. Shelter is also for your tools. A small dry rack built over the coals can harden wooden pegs. It can dry out your damp cordage. It can save your moccasins from freezing solid overnight. A notch cut in a green stick becomes a perfect hanger for a pot or for a bag of food, lifted up and out of reach of animals. A roof that extends just a little bit beyond your work area, that makes a space where you can do tasks in the rain without needing a big, wasteful fire. Now, some villages, of course, built huge, long structures for winter and group living. You see the plank houses of the northwest or the long houses of the northeast. Those are incredible, but they take massive skill and time. That's not what we're talking about here. What a traveler borrows is the small habit that sits inside that larger one. The habit of keeping a dry place for your tools. The habit of hanging things where smoke and heat can cure them rather than ruin them. And how did this knowledge survive? Neighbors taught neighbors. Families taught children. A boy learns how to bend saplings and tie them from his grandmother. She laughs when his first frame collapses, and then she shows him how to set his feet and hands so the arch holds. A girl learns to lay cattail mats, and she learns to judge the thickness by how the mat feels against her palm. These skills did not belong to men alone or women alone. They belonged to the work that needed to be done. In some places, sure, men might fell the trees and set the frames, while women wove the mats and dressed the bark. In other places, those assignments shifted, based on the season and just who was available. The habits survived because they were useful, and because they were not treated as some big secret. You can practice this today without harming a place. Use deadfall for your boughs and poles. Get permission where you need it. Build small. Learn the feel of a ridgepole that's solid, that won't sag. Go twist cordage from the weeds in an empty lot, and then pull on it until you trust it. Sleep out. With a simple lean-to and a long fire, on a damp night somewhere near your home, where you can easily retreat if you misjudge something. Pay attention. Pay attention to the quality of your sleep. Pay attention to the tasks that felt slow, just because the steps were new, and then do them again, on a calmer day. Do them until they feel as normal as folding a coat. There's one more piece. This is what turns a shelter from just a structure into a system. It's the pattern. It's what you do as the evening falls. A routine. A routine is what holds you when the weather is trying to take all your attention. People learn this by repetition. Arrive. Set the ridgepole. Gather boughs. Lay the bed. Do all of this before you lose the light. Then fire. Then water. Then food. Then drying your clothes. Then checking the roof. And last, banking the coals for the night. The order matters. If you cook first, you're sitting on damp ground getting cold and stiff. If you light a big fire before you have a bed, you're just spending heat without having any way to hold it. If you don't check your roof after the fire changes the air, you might discover a leak at midnight. A simple routine saves you from having to make choices when you're hungry and you're tempted to skip steps. There are disagreements in the record about all of this, about the names, the origins, and there should be the same forms. They appear in many, many regions. Why? Because wind and rain impose the same demands on people who are built alike and who get cold at the same rate. One position will credit a particular nation with the first or the finest version of a lean-to. Another position emphasizes that form follows place, that many peoples arrived at similar, smart answers, all on their own. What matters to you when you're building a shelter on a tired evening? It's less about the origin and more about the effect. A ridge, ribs, and thatch make a lean-to. Mats and a bent frame make a dome. Snow, dug correctly, becomes a quiet room. Plant fibers twist into ties. Roots sew bark. Grass insulates your feet. These are low-drama answers to very predictable problems. And when you walk away in the morning, a good shelter leaves little trace. The boughs you cut, they go back under the trees to rot and feed the soil. The fire is drowned, and the coals are scattered. The mats return to the reeds. The snow roof collapses, and it becomes a smooth drift again when the sun touches it. This ethic of care, it grows from living for many seasons in one home range. People did not undo their own hunting or their own gathering by leaving camps filthy or scarred. You can adopt that same ethic, even when you're just a visitor. It's not even about rules. It's about returning a place to the condition that serves you and the next person and the animals that live there. Heat matters most when you can hold it. A small fire, all by itself, is like money left on a table in a strong wind. It can be enough, and it can be gone at the same time. But a small fire, behind a lean-to, and in front of a bed that resists the pull of the wet soil, that becomes steady wealth. A sleeping body that loses very little heat spends less energy in the night, and it wakes with more to give to the day. In history, these habits, they weren't remarkable enough to write songs about, so they just appear in journals and in drawings, and in the quiet notes of visitors who were just trying to make sense of how families could live with so little gear and so much skill. You do not need to be perfect to benefit. You just need to know what to do first, and what to do next, and what is good enough when your hands are cold. And you need to know how to add just one more layer when the wind insists on teaching you again. Imagine you finish your day. You've only got an hour of light left, and a steady cold rain is rolling in. You pick the lee of that low rise. You set your ridgepole and your ribs. You thatch it with boughs. You lay a piece of bark where the roof might drip. You build your bed until your weight sinks and then springs back. You light that small fire in front of the opening. You let it burn down to a good bed of coals. You hang your wet glove on a stick and you turn it gently. You eat your warm food. with your back against your dry bed. You bank the coals. You pull your blanket or your bag over your shoulders, and just over your head, enough to stop the drafts. You just listen. You listen to the rain change from a patter to a heavier rhythm as the front passes. Your roof darkens, and then it shines in the firelight. You don't think of centuries. You don't think of names. You just think of your next breath, and you think of the small, quiet room of warmth that exists, because people showed you how to build it, and you listened. Morning starts with the taste of last night's smoke on your tongue, and a really old question. It's a question that has pulled at travelers since the first person took the first steps across an open plain. Where is the next water, and how will you carry it? Fire will give you heat, and it gives you a way to make that water safe. Shelter will hold the warmth you earn, but without water, both of those skills start to lose their strength in just a few short hours. People who lived by moving, they knew this. And they built a quiet set of habits that turn a map of just hills and flats into a map of moisture. These habits are not a secret. They're just a way of looking. It's a way you can practice until the land itself just starts to answer you. Your eye goes first to color. In dry country, a patch of green, the deep green of a cottonwood grove. It means roots. It means roots in a seam of groundwater, or a channel that still runs, even if it's just below the sand. Willow trees, they favor the same places. Sycamores, out in the southwest, they stand where a wash runs in its season. And in the northern woods, a line of alder in a low swale that tells you that water is going to gather there when the snow melts, or when a storm lingers. Now, there's a disagreement. How reliable are trees for finding surface water right here, right now? One position holds that, yeah, these deep-rooted trees, they can reach water that's way below the surface. They could mislead a thirsty traveler into walking to a dry patch of ground. Another position holds that, in many valleys and flats, the same roots that reach that steady moisture. They often mean there's a shallow seep nearby if you just read the land with a little patience. Both are true, at different times. What you borrow isn't a promise, it's a clue. It's a clue that tells you where to check when the sun is high and you want certainty before you spend any more sweat. Birds. Birds carry messages if you learn their routines. Doves and songbirds, they almost always go to water in the morning and in the evening. You watch a flock rise in this smooth arc and then just settle out of sight. You can follow that line and you can find a pool that's probably edged with tracks, ravens and hawks. They don't tell you the same story. They range too far and they drink less often. In desert canyons, insects get thicker near hidden seeps. A cloud of gnats just hanging in the still air at dusk. That means there's damp stone nearby. In the northern spring, frogs give themselves away with sound. A sound that travels down the whole length of a creek, even when you can't see the channel yet through the new leaves. Dry riverbeds. They are not always dry under the skin. In many regions you look for a bend, a spot where the current would have slowed down during a flood. This leaves a bar of sand. On the inside of that bend, if you dig a foot or two below the surface, water often lingers in that cooler sand. A seep well is just a small pit, dug by hand, in a place exactly like this. The first water that fills it. It's cloudy. It's muddy. You wait. You just wait. It clears. Then you can drink without scooping up all that sand. Along the channel of a dry wash, you can read the darker, damper zones under the morning shade of a bank. Those are the places to dig. In parts of the southwest, you'll find tinajas. These are natural tanks in the bedrock that hold rainwater in shaded hollows. You can find them by following the polished channels in the rock and the stain lines that show where high water has been. In the northern shield country, water hides in beaver channels that weave between ponds, and the sound of moving water, it carries so much further in the evening air, when the wind finally rests. Families traveling by canoe would listen for that sound just as carefully as they'd listen for the first hiss of a kettle. There's a simple trick too for mornings when there is no pool. Dew. Dew gathers on grasses and plants before the sun pulls it back into the air. A clean cloth dragged across a meadow, it will gather enough moisture to wring out into a cup. It's not elegant, but it is effective. In some coastal zones, fog will condense on netted structures, and it'll drain into containers. People just use the shapes at hand. In a grove, a rope of plant fiber with moss knotted along it. You can stretch that under a dripping branch, and it will guide the water right to your bowl. You make the tools of the day from the day. When you come upon a rock face and water is just seeping along a crack, you can push a little twist of grass into that crack, and it acts as a small spout. It brings the water out to where you can actually catch it. But water is not safety, not until it is safe to drink. The oldest, simplest, and most reliable method is to heat it until it rolls. A rolling boil changes what lives in that cup. In places where there was no pot to set in a flame, those hot stones, they did the work. A bowl of bark, a basket sealed with pitch, a hole in clay, lined with a hide. Any of them can turn into a kettle just by moving stones from the coals into the water. Remember, you wipe the stones clean of ash first. You let them heat slowly so they don't crack. You keep them moving. The water rises through stages, and your hand learns to read those stages by the steam and by the way it wakes up the scent of the cup. There are accounts from the northwest and the interior of families boiling in baskets, day after day. Observers wrote about broth being made by dropping hot stones into a mix of meat, roots, and water, until the food softened and the liquid simmered. They also recorded the exact same method being used for tea and for making water clean, when the only container they had was one that would burn if you set it in the coals. There is some disagreement about plant infusions. Were they purifiers, or were they just for flavor? One position points to the antimicrobial qualities of some resins and tannins. It suggests that adding certain barks or needles might have reduced the risk in marginal water. Another position cautions that the main safety still comes from heat, and that plants that just change the taste. They can disguise a hazard rather than remove it. You don't need to resolve that debate to benefit from the core rule. Boil your water when you doubt it. Flavor it if it lifts your spirit. But don't let a good taste blind you to the process that saves you. Containers. Containers are what turn moving from one pool to the next into a much more certain project. Birch bark. It's flexible. It's durable. When it's cut and shaped in the right season. It can be folded into cups and buckets. The fold holds if it's sewn with split root and then sealed with a smear of resin along the seams. In many places, families made large bark vessels just to haul water to camp. Then they'd set them on racks to dry each night. Spruce roots, split and smoothed, become a sewing thread that will not cut the bark. Elm bark, peeled in the spring, comes off in huge sheets that can be bent into troughs. In the south, gourds were dried into canteens. Animal bladders, washed and tied, were sometimes used to carry liquids for short distances. There's a debate about how widespread the everyday use of bladders was, beyond, say, a hunting scene where you just needed to keep blood or water for an hour. One view sees them as common and practical. Another sees them as only occasional tools, not primary carriers. Because bark and woven containers, they just last longer and carry more. The practical part for you is clear. A container you can make from what grows in your region that turns any pool into a store for the next mile. Discipline around water. It's not just about finding it and carrying it. It is about how you move your body in the heat. In deserts and hot valleys, people didn't just brute force their way through the midday Sunday, they traveled at dawn and at evening. They rested in the shade during that hottest part of the day. They used simple tools. Wide hats, hoods, or woven headbands kept the direct sun off the skull. Loose-fitting clothing that wasn't just for comfort. It was a tool. It slowed evaporation just enough to keep your sweat working, cooling you, rather than just flashing away without doing any good. They drank in sips. Mouthfuls, taken often, work so much better than a long, deep drink that just tempts you to waste water too quickly. There are accounts of runners in the north carrying small, simple birch bark cups tucked right into their belts. They just dip at a creek, drink, and keep moving. There's another piece to this. Food. People carried food that supported their hydration. In the south, you hear stories of roasted maize, ground into a fine meal, carried in pouches. It was mixed with water to make a nourishing drink. Pinole, as many Spanish writers called it. The Tarahumara people, famous for their long-distance running, were powered by this simple, brilliant sustenance. In other regions, it was parched corn, roasted and cracked. A handful of this in your water, it becomes food and drink, all at once. The point is simple and powerful. Carry a food that doesn't steal water from your body just to digest it. But the cold does not end the water question. It just changes it. Now, snow is water, but it's water that will take heat from you to melt. Eating snow directly is a bad idea. It cools your core, and it just makes your mouth feel drier. It's always better to melt snow in a container. And here's a pro tip. Add it gradually to a little bit of warm water you already have. If you just pack a pot full of snow and stick it on a fire, you're going to scorch the bottom of your pot or your basket. In spruce country, people made tea from the needles. It's rich in scent, it's warm, and it gives you a little lift. On a frozen river, chipping the clear black ice near the current, that will give you water with a lot less grit than scooping up snow. And on spring ice, caution is survival. The top surface might be hard, but the base underneath can be rotting away. Families learn to read the color and the sound of the ice. Blue-black ice. That's the stuff that holds. White, layered ice that hides weak spots. You must use a staff or a pole. You test the ice ahead of your first step. That staff is what tells you the truth, before your body does. There are stories of travelers using a simple hand sled, a toboggan, to carry water in the form of ice blocks and firewood between camps. It just meant making fewer trips over that uncertain ice. A sled is a container of a different kind. It's one that carries what you need, without you having to shoulder all of the weight. So, you have your water. The land still asks you to find your route through it, and to do it with judgment. Wayfinding. This is the skill that turns a simple choice of path into a plan that repeats its success day after day. People used everything: the stars, the sun, the wind, the watercourses, and the very shape of the ground under their feet. In open country, the North Star is a fixed point. In many latitudes, you can find it using the pointers of the Big Dipper, or by looking at that W shape of Cassiopeia. That star doesn't rise, and it doesn't set. It holds. Even in a thick forest, it will show itself in clearings, or at the bends in a river. The Sunday. The sun is a slower teacher. Its arc changes with the seasons, but a stick in the ground and a shadow, that's an ancient clock and compass. The shortest shadow it throws, that's noon. A stone placed at the tip of the shadow in the morning, and another at the tip of the shadow in the afternoon. A line between those two stones will run roughly west to east. On days when the sky just hides the Sunday, you look at the wind patterns. You look at the shapes of the trees. In many regions, the prevailing winds will groom the crowns of the trees, giving them this subtle, constant lean. A constant wind will carve snow into hard waves, called sastrugi, that point in known directions. No single sign is enough. You're not looking for one sign. You are building a net of observations, so that if one strand fails, the others catch you. Rivers and ridges. These are the oldest highways. A ridge grants you clear views and, usually, drier footing. It keeps you out of the thick marsh and the tangled brush in the lowlands. Water divides. These are the high lines that separate drainage basins. In many traditions, trails ran from ridge to ridge, and from a river to a portage, and back to the river. The marks that kept these lines visible were as simple as a blaze on a piece of bark, or a small pile of stones, a cairn placed where a bend in the trail could confuse the eye. Now, there is a disagreement. It's about the use of intentionally bent trees as long-term trail markers in the eastern forests. One position holds that yes, people shaped young saplings. They used ties and weights so that they would grow into these clear, pointing forms. They'd be recognizable for decades, and they would guide travelers to springs or fords or hidden camps. Another position cautions that while some trees were likely trained, many are just the result of storms or snow or animal damage, and reading them as a secret code that can mislead you. The careful approach: you treat a bent tree as a clue, but only when it agrees with all the other signs. You follow the lay of the land first. You let the marks confirm what the ground is already telling you. Memory. Memory did much of the work that our paper maps and GPS do now. Place names. They would link a sequence of features into a line you could sing. A low hill, named for a bison, and a creek, named for an edible plant. That becomes a verse that a child can recall, even when snow has hidden the shapes. Families remembered the order of camps in a season, winter counts, those beautiful pictorial records kept by some plains peoples. They noted the key event of each year, and they anchored the stories to a specific time and place. Wampum belts among the Haudenosaunee carried agreements and history in beads that speakers learned to read aloud. These aren't just navigation tools in the modern sense. They show how routes and places and history, they all live together in the mind and in a shared memory. The lesson for a modern traveler is to narrate your route to yourself as you go. Name the hill. Note the bend in the river that points like a finger toward that far notch in the ridge. Say it out loud if you have to. The brain stores what the mouth speaks. When the fog drops, or the dusk presses in, those words will bring back the map you just walked. And, on a smaller scale, tracking. Tracking keeps you oriented to what passed before you, and it orients you to your own passage when you have to return. Fresh deer tracks. They cross a trail, and they turn downhill. That tells you that water and cover lie that way. A line of human prints with a long stride and scuffed toe marks? That means haste. That means wait. A wide, blurred track where your own prints are sinking deeper than they were an hour ago. That tells you the soil has softened. You've moved into a different band of moisture. Some nations taught tracking as a formal, deep discipline. Others just learned it. By play and by work in the same places year after year. There are disagreements in modern writing about this. How far can you really press tracking for precise conclusions versus just general ones? One view emphasizes this remarkable individual skill at reading hours and moods in a line of prints. Another emphasizes that many safe decisions just come from broad patterns, not from fine readings. Adopt the safe part first. Recognize the passage of animals to find water and food, and recognize your own passage, so you can come back to that good, safe camp, if you must. Now, moving with a load. That becomes a lot easier when the load is carried in the way that your bones and your muscles actually prefer. And that brings us to the tump line. It's a simple strap, but it's a piece of genius. It's a wide strap that runs over the top of your head, across your forehead, and then down to a pack or a bundle that sits behind your shoulders. It looks old, because it is old. And it works. It spreads that weight through your spine and your hips, and it leaves your arms completely free. You can use your hands to carry a paddle, or a staff, or to push branches aside. In the north, in that birch bark canoe country, portage packs were lashed to simple wooden frames and carried with tump lines along those rough, muddy trails between lakes and rivers. Travelers moved everything this way: cordwood, meat, trade bundles. In the south, people used head straps to carry heavy baskets of food from the fields. There is today some debate in modern circles about the long-term effects of head-carried loads. One position points to studies of neck strain, especially if you have poor technique or you're carrying excessive weight. Another position notes that people who learn to carry this way from youth, they develop the specific muscles and the habits that make it incredibly efficient and safe. You can learn the modest version. For a short carry, a wide folded strap tied to your pack, it frees up your hands. And it can change a few small, hard miles into much smaller, easier ones. Food. Food that travels well. This supports your water discipline, and it supports your navigation. Why? Because it turns your rest stops into quick, efficient fueling stops. And it lightens the whole puzzle of where you have to stop and what you have to do. Parch corn, which was carried by many groups, is a foundation of this. You take grains of corn, you roast them until they crack, and then you either grind them or just keep them whole. You can eat them as is, just crunchy, or you can steep them in a little hot water to soften them up. And then there's pemmican. This is the famous, compact, stable energy store that was carried all across the plains and the north woods. It's a mixture of dried meat, pounded into almost a powder, and then combined with rendered fat. Sometimes berries were added. There's some disagreement, of course, about the exact recipes, which varied by region and by period. One position notes that many of the northern versions, they kept the meat and the fat pure, just those two ingredients, This was for maximum long-term storage. You'd only mix in berries right when you were about to eat it. Another position notes that many of the southern and plains variants, they incorporated things like choke cherries or other fruits right at the time of making it. Both of these describe a food that does one thing. It resists spoilage, and it delivers a ton of strength without you ever having to light a fire. The lesson for your pack? Carry something that does not demand a flame to be useful. Roasted nuts, dried meat, those roasted grains. They're all faithful to that exact same smart idea. And the containers for this food, and for your water, they traveled more as skills than as just things. A basket, woven from willow or spruce root, can hold water if it's pitched or if it's woven tightly enough. A skin bag, sewn up tight, can carry soup or broth. If you set it inside a larger bowl and you heat it with hot stones, a bark bucket is incredibly light. A woman could carry two on a simple shoulder pole, a gourd dipper, that just becomes an extension of your hand at camp. The point here, it's not nostalgia. It's that a person who knows how to make and repair a container, that person does not become fragile just because a plastic bottle cracks. You can practice these arts on a weekend. You can sew a seam of bark with some strong fiber. Fill it with water, set it aside, and see if it leaks. You can learn how pine pitch softens with heat and how it seals a leak when it cools. You can make your mistakes where they cost you nothing, and then you can carry that memory for when it might be needed. When you're choosing your path, your route, you need to think like water, and you need to think like wind. Water. It always seeks the shallowest gradient that still moves downhill. Wind. It swings around obstacles, and it accelerates through the gaps. On foot, you do the same thing, just to waste less effort. You follow a bench, that flat, step-like feature on the side of a hill. It holds your altitude, rather than you having to dive into every single ravine and climb back out. You take a saddle, that low point on a ridge, instead of climbing all the way over the peak, just to cross to the other side. If you must drop down to a river for water, you plan your climb back up to happen in the cool hours of the morning, not in the heat of the afternoon. In the far north, travelers along the coast and on the rivers, they learn to read ice and tide. In the high desert, travelers read the shade lines. They'd plan their long rest to be under a cliff in the early afternoon, when that shadow would move over them like a slow, cool door. These are not emergencies. These are arrangements. They're arrangements with the world that you make, simply because you have watched how the world works. Signals. Signals between people. They multiply your safety. Smoke by day and a flame by night. They carry much farther than a voice. In some open regions, small piles of stones, no higher than your knee, would mark a safe crossing on a river or a turn in the trail where a wash forks. In the forests, a fresh blaze on a tree would confirm a route to a party that was trailing behind. There is a debate. How standardized were these signal meanings between different nations and across long distances? One position says systems were totally local. They were taught within families or maybe small alliances. Another says that, no, certain shapes and counts were widely understood, especially along major travel corridors. Regardless of the system, the gentle, useful lesson for a small party today is to just agree on a few simple signs before you separate. A branch, bent and tucked at a junction, pointing left. That's an arrow to your own people. 3 stones in a row on top of a boulder. They're pointing, with the smallest stone as the head. These work, if you don't overuse them. A land that's littered with arrows. It's not a language anymore. It's just noise. And your body. Your body is so much easier to keep steady if you manage your sweat and your salt with the same calm that you bring to your fire and your shelter. When you drink a lot of water, in the heat, you are losing salt. Some of those travel foods we talked about, they replace it. Meat and broth. They give you both water and salt. Those parched grains, mixed with just a pinch of salt taken slowly, that will steady you more than plain water ever could. There are accounts of people in hot climates. They would dissolve a little bit of ash from certain plants into their water, because that ash contained minerals that would replace what their sweat was taking out. Now, there's disagreement about the safety and the sense of this practice. One view points to the value of the minerals in ash, from plants that are high in natural salts. Another view, it worries that ash from other plants can bring lye, which irritates and harms. The prudent way, today, you carry a small amount of salt, and you eat when you drink, so the water you're taking in, it doesn't just run right through you without staying. If you get turned around, that first choice you make, it matters more than anything that follows. The rule is simple. Stop. Just stop. And make your next step a known one, not just a panicked guess. People who lived in one place for generations, they taught their children anchor moves. These were the default, safe answers. If you lose your line, what do? You move to water, and you make a safe camp. Period. If you're on a high ridge and the clouds just drop, swallowing everything in a whiteout, you sit. You sit with your back to a tree, and you wait for the visibility to lift. You do not walk off into that whiteout, potentially right off a cornice. If night is coming fast, and you have no shelter yet, you find a windbreak, and you make your bed before you even think about a fire. These rules sound simple, and they are. They are what prevent a small, single error from feeding on itself, growing and growing until it becomes that story. You know, the story about the time you almost didn't come back. The land, it is just indifferent to your hurry. It's indifferent to your pride. It rewards the person who pauses and chooses the certain move over the bold one. Stories. Stories hold this knowledge so much better than a list of instructions, especially when the weather and the clock are pressing in. So, let me tell you a story. Picture a young man. He's in the high desert. It's the end of a long, hot day. He has a skin bag, about half full of water. He's got a small pouch of roasted meal. His plan is to make it to a known spring by dusk. But the heat, it just didn't break as early as he hoped. He's scanning the landscape. He sees a stand of cottonwood trees, and he notices they're leaning away from the wash. He reads that. He sees that they favor a bend just below. So he drops into the wash, where the high banks are finally throwing a short shadow. He presses his palm to the sand. It feels cool. He digs with a stick, right where the sand looks a little darker. The hole fills. Slowly. So slowly. He waits. He's patient. He knows that scooping at the mud only lengthens the wait. He dips his cup. He fills his bag. He mixes a little bit of that meal into his cup, and he eats. Then he walks on. Only when the air softens and the first swallows start cutting across the sky. He reaches the spring at last light, just as the bats begin to work. He did nothing flashy. He didn't collapse into a long thirst that would turn tomorrow into a trial. He just matched his moves to the place. Let's see another story, this time from the cold north. It's early spring. Ice is breaking up along the river. A woman and her brother are on a portage, carrying their gear around a stretch of quick water. They're on a known trail, but the roots are slick from the melt. They're carrying their loads with tump lines, steady against their backs. They set their packs down. They test the ice at a crossing, where a backwater still looks like it holds. The woman's staff. It sinks through on the third poke. They don't step. They just don't. They turn, and they angle upstream to a narrower place where the current has thickened the ice. They cross in a single file. They've untied their lines so they can shed their weight quickly if needed. On the far bank, they find a small seep running clear and cold from a hillside. They fill their birch bark buckets. They return to their camp where their grandmother is waiting. The girl, she sees a small, loose seam on one of the buckets. She takes a strand of spruce root, warms it in a pot so it bends without cracking, and she sews the seam tight. She wipes a little bit of pitch along the stitches. The repair takes minutes. It will serve for weeks. None of this requires a speech. It is the quiet language of a place. It's taught to children until they just carry it forward, without ever thinking they own some rare, secret thing. There is a real temptation in modern life to treat all these methods as tricks. They are not. They are the way. They are the way families used a landscape, with care and with deep attention. If you find water by watching doves drink at dawn, because someone showed you that, you are just part of a long, unbroken chain. If you carry your pack with a head strap because it frees your hands, you're just borrowing an answer that thousands of feet tested on thousands of portages and trails. If you map a valley by naming 5 landmarks out loud, and then turning those names into a little story you repeat as you walk, you are doing what people have always done, in places where paper and signs are not always with you. So, when you walk tomorrow, carry a small cup. Carry a tie that you can turn into a strap. Carry a pouch of roasted food that will not demand a fire. And carry the willingness to look twice before you push forward. Water hides. It hides in sand and in stone and in leaves. And your root hides in the shape of the slopes and in the way the wind writes on the grass. You have learned to light and keep a fire. You have learned to hold that warmth with a roof and a bed. Now, you learn to find and hold water, and you learn to move across a map that is not on paper, but is right under your feet. If you do that, the long line of a journey, it turns from this coil of worry into a steady, calm measure of moments. Moments that you can handle, one by one, as they arrive. Food. Food is the weight you carry inside you. And in a very real way, it is the measure of exactly how far you can go. You've mapped your water. You've chosen your line across the valley. The very next decision is, how are you going to feed strength back into your body? And how are you going to do it in ways that don't cost you more energy than they give? Families who lived by moving, they solved this. They had a calendar. But it wasn't a calendar written on a page. It was a calendar written in plants, in animals, and in weather signs. They did not ask the land to be the same, month after month. That's a fool's game. Instead, they watched. They watched what arrived, and they watched what left. And they matched their work to that rhythm. When you do that, hunger stops being a breaking point. It just becomes a challenge. The year for you begins right where you stand. In many northern forests, the first foods of spring aren't berries. They're the tender new shoots of plants, and they're the last of the nuts you stored from winter. In the deserts, the first fruits are often flowers, or early, bitter greens, or the pods from last year, finely ground into meal. A person who pays attention, they can see how the color green advances up a hillside as the days get warm, and they watch how that color retreats as the nights get longer in the fall. You follow that gradient. You don't stand idle at a river and say, "The fish are late." No, you move. You move to the bend in the river, the one with the first deep pool that's tempering the cold water. That's where the first insects are going to hatch, and that's where the fish will be. In oak country, the acorns that fed you through the winter, they become the meal that carries you into the spring. In the North Lakes, the wild rice that you shook loose last fall, that becomes a sack of grains. Grains that can be parched and winnowed and cooked in just a few minutes, on a day when the wind and the rain are shortening your plans. We have to talk about acorns, because acorns are a full lesson, just disguised as a plain nut. Oaks carry many, many kinds of acorns. They have different flavors, and they have different levels of tannins. Tannins are what make the meal bitter, and they're hard on your stomach. Families, especially in California, develop these incredibly careful, smart methods to leach those tannins out. One common way was to grind the acorn kernels into a superfine meal on a stone. Then they'd spread that meal in a shallow depression, maybe one they'd lined with clean sand, and they'd just pour water over it in steady, patient amounts until all that bitterness ran out. Another way, they'd set a woven basket full of the meal right in a stream. They'd just let the slow, cool current wash through the meal, hour after hour. And of course there's a disagreement about which method dominated. Was sand leaching used more, or was basket leaching? One position sees the sand basins as really efficient if you had clean sand and a good water source right there. Another position emphasizes the baskets. Why? No grit in your food. And the basket is portable. You can adapt that same logic with modern tools. A fine meal always leaches faster than a coarse one. And running water, that's a tool that does the work for you while you're doing other tasks. Once it's leached, that acorn meal, it cooks up fast, and it stores well. Then there are the roots. Roots that look so humble, so plain. They can carry entire peoples through a season when you handle them right. In the wet meadows of the Northwest, camas bulbs were a staple. But you couldn't just eat them raw. They would feed families after they went through these long, slow pit bakes. This process, it's like magic. It changes the complex starches in the plant into sugars that your body can actually use. The work, it sounds tedious. Until you see the result. You dig a shallow pit. You line it with stones. You get a fire going, get those stones hot. You put in the bulbs, cleaned and layered with damp leaves, and maybe a little water to create steam. You cover it all with more leaves, and then soil, and you seal it up. It becomes an oven that holds a low, steady heat all night long. In the morning you open it up, and those bulbs are dark and sticky and sweet. There's a debate among modern writers. How long does a proper bake take? One view holds that, for the best change you need a full day and a night. Another view notes that, look, even short cooks will still soften and sweeten the bulbs enough to eat. The principle holds, regardless. Time and low heat do what a hot, fast flame cannot. and the same exact method. It applies to agave and yucca hearts in desert country. Families would roast them in these earth ovens until their tough fibers yielded and their sugars deepened. A traveler who learns how to use a shallow pit and a few hot stones, that person learns how to unlock calories from plants that would taste harsh and useless if you just tried to rush them. Let's look at cattail. It grows right where the water lingers, and it's a generous plant. It offers you different parts to eat in 3 different seasons. In the spring, the new shoots are crisp and mild, almost like a cucumber. When the plant is mature, the rhizomes, those thick, starchy, root-like structures, you can pound them and wash them to get a fine flour. And in the early summer, the pollen, it's this bright yellow dust. You can just shake it into a sack and then mix it into a simple cake that cooks up in minutes on a flat stone right beside your coals. People who lived with these plants, they took only what they needed. They left the stands to regrow. They understood that a single bed of cattails can feed a family for many years, but only if it's not stripped bare. If you try this today, take the smallest fraction, learn the taste, and watch how the stand responds to you. That habit of restraint. It's not just a nice decoration, it is what makes tomorrow possible. Up in the north, wild rice is a food that teaches both care and technique. It's a masterclass. Harvesters would paddle their canoes gently through the beds. They'd use 2 sticks, one to bend the seed head over the canoe and one to tap it. The ripe grains would fall into the canoe. The unripe grains, still green, would remain on the stalk. This method is brilliant. It prevents uprooting the plant, and it preserves the stand for next year. In fact, it's a form of reseeding. After the harvest, the grains are parched, toasted over a low, smoky heat. This stops them from germinating and makes the hull brittle. Then, they're hulled, often by treading on them with moccasined feet or by using a mortar and pestle. And finally, they're winnowed. You toss them in the wind, or just shake them in wide, flat baskets. The light chaff blows away, and the heavy, nutritious grain falls back. Now, there are disagreements about the details of this across different lakes and different nations. One position notes the deep, deep experience of the Anishinaabe, or Ojibwe, who manage their rice beds with ceremonies and very strict, specific practices that protect the plant. Another position notes that many neighboring peoples also harvested rice, maybe with different tools or on a different schedule, but they all shared the same core ethics. The part for you to carry forward is simple. Take what is ripe and leave what is not. Process what you have without a wasteful hurry, so you don't lose the very thing you just gathered. When you finally eat a bowl of hot wild rice, maybe with a little meat or some berries, you're eating more than just grain. You're eating the outcome of a practice that keeps an entire lake, an entire ecosystem alive. Let's go to the desert. Desert country seems empty until you look at it with the right questions. Mesquite trees. They drop these pods that dry into a sweet, hard food. You can crack them open and grind them into a nutritious meal. Prickly pear cactus. It offers its pads, the nopales, and its fruits, the tunas, if you know how to remove all those tiny hair-like spines, the glockids, without wasting the pulp. And the saguaro. Its fruit ripens high up, on these tall, towering arms that do not welcome a climber. The Tohono O'odham people. They use long poles, often made from the woody ribs of a dead saguaro itself, to knock those fruits down. Then they gather them, and they cook them down into a rich syrup and a paste that can be stored for months. There's some disagreement among observers about the exact season for this, and the degree to which this one harvest anchored the entire social calendar. But all the accounts agree that this fruit was absolutely central to their food stores, especially in the hot, dry months. You may not be able to harvest saguaro fruit today because of laws and permissions, but you can learn from the reach. You can learn from the pole, a long, simple tool. It just extends your hand. A fruit that's gathered without harming the plant, that is a gift to later walkers, and it's a gift to yourself. Okay, let's talk protein. Protein often comes first from the water because water gathers life. Fish weirs. These are a slow, patient technology, but they multiply a small initial effort into a steady, reliable source of food. A weir is just a fence, a line of stakes and stones set across a stream with gaps that get narrower and that funnel the fish toward a trap. The fish, moving with the current, they just swim into the trap and then they're held there. A quick lift of a basket or a move with a dip net and the work is done. In tidal flats you'd see the same idea. A V-shaped wall of rocks would direct fish into a pocket as the tide went out. There is, of course, a disagreement about how old and how widespread some of those rock weirs are, the ones you can still see along some coasts. Are they ancient? Or are some of them younger than we suppose, just because tides and storms can rebuild and move forms pretty fast? One position sees them as ancient. Another notes that some communities renewed and rebuilt them, generation after generation, making their age a living thing rather than a single fixed date. You can borrow the part that's not controversial. A funnel concentrates movement. A basket with a narrow throat will hold fish better than one with a wide open mouth. Even a small V you make out of brush in a tiny creek will guide fish right into your hands if you have patience and you don't chase them. Eels in the northeast were trapped in wicker pots. They were speared at night in narrow channels. Their fat and their dense meat that feeds you differently than a lean fish does. Salmon in the northwest were dried on huge racks over low smoky fires to last all through the winter. They'd use cedar planks to hold the fillets near the heat so that the smoke and the warm air could work on the flesh without the flames ever scorching it. There's disagreement here too. How far upriver was this plank cooking practiced versus just using campfire spits and racks? And which woods flavored the fish the best without making it bitter? One position praises cedar for both the structure and the taste. Another notes that, well, in regions where cedar was poor or scarce, alder and other woods carried the day just fine. The pattern is what matters. Slow air and mild smoke. That is what prevents spoilage. Even if you only have one small fish, if you cut it into thin slices or strips, it will dry faster and safer than a thick, whole fillet. Small game is food that moves, and it requires a different kind of technique, one that uses your time wisely. This is where snares come in. A snare set on a narrow, obvious animal run, a place where rabbits pass every single day. That's a smart investment. You can build little funnels from brush, just to guide them right to that spot. This simple setup converts a few minutes of work into a chance of getting meat while you're off doing other tasks. It's working for you when you're not there. A spring pole snare is a more advanced version. It's designed to lift a caught animal up, clear of the path. A figure-4 deadfall is another classic trap. It uses a simple, clever trigger to drop a heavy weight when an animal nudges the bait. Now, there's a debate among modern teachers about this. How much time should a beginner really spend practicing these complex triggers versus just focusing on reading the path and using simple, non-lifting snares tied to a solid anchor? One view says, practice those triggers. Practice them until they are pure muscle memory. Another view says, no, master the path first, because a simple snare on the right path, that's more than half the task right there. So, let's keep the safe, practical part for now. Learn to read the trails. Look for those little tunnels that run under thick brush. Look for the paths along fences and at the edges of clearings. Set just a few snares carefully rather than a whole bunch of them poorly. Check them often and never waste what you take. Birds. They offer eggs in some seasons and they offer meat in others. Along the coasts, families would gather eggs from nesting cliffs and islands. But they did it with care, never stripping a whole colony. There's disagreement, of course, about how often this was practiced and how different communities managed that risk of taking too many. But the tradition, in many places, is clear. Take a small share. Leave the rest to keep the birds returning. In your own walking life, you must know the laws and the ethics of where you are before you even think about imitating any of this. But in a true survival need, the principle to remember is to always leave the breeding pairs, always leave the next generation, whenever you possibly can. Hunger that erases tomorrow, that is a very poor teacher. Okay, so you've got your food. Now, the cooking methods. These are what turn tough, raw food into ready, usable strength. We've already talked about stone boiling, and it works just as well for meat and roots as it does for water. A piece of lean meat, cut small, and simmered with a few roots, that will give so much more to your body than that same piece of meat just charred and chewed off a stick. Earth ovens. They turn stringy, tough fibers into a softness that saves your teeth and saves your patience. Those flat stones, heated and wiped clean, they cook thin breads from your acorn meal, or your mesquite meal, or your ground seeds. And they do it in a few minutes, with very little fuel. When the wind is rising and the rain is falling, that ability to cook fast and to cover your pan with another bark disc or another flat stone, that's what keeps the grit out and the heat in. A traveler who knows 10 small ways to cook without a heavy metal pot, that person moves lighter, and that person eats better. Now, let's talk about turning today's luck into next week's certainty. This is all about food that lasts. Drying and smoking. These are the twin pillars. You take thin strips of meat. You hang them high over a smoky, not a flaming fire. They dry without cooking. The smoke, it keeps the insects away, and it adds that natural, preservative effect. Meat that's dried hard like this, it's not really a meal by itself. But you pound it. You pound it fine, and you mix it with that rendered fat. Now it becomes pemmican. It becomes a compact, dense food that will not spoil easily. When berries are in season, you can dry them whole. Or you can mash them up and dry them into these thin sheets, fruit leather, that you can just fold up and carry. There is a disagreement about exactly how much fat you need to protect the dried meat without making the whole thing go rancid, especially in warm weather. One position aims for a balance, just enough fat to coat all the fibers thoroughly. Another position, they keep the fat and the meat separate and only mix them right before they're eaten. If you test this, choose what fits your climate and keep your portions small. The lesson is to make food that can be eaten without work. Make it on a day when the sun is shining, for that day when the rain steals your tinder and your legs feel like lead. Caching. This multiplies the reach of your camp. A cache is just a safe storage spot. A pit in the ground, lined with bark or dried grasses, and then roofed over with logs and earth, that stores your roots, your nuts, and your dried meat, right where the ground temperature holds steady. Poles, set to raise a cache above the ground. That's what protects your food from bears and from damp. In some regions, parfleche bags, these stiff, rawhide containers. They carried dried meat, and they were hung from the rafters of a shelter or from a high pole. There's a debate about how often caches were robbed by animals, and how did the designs change to reduce that risk. One view credits hanging caches, especially in the open air, where smoke from a camp could reach them. Another view, it trusts the pits. Trust the ground with strong lids and a careful sealing off of any scent. In a modern setting, you can borrow this logic with the simple bear bag habit. You hang your food far enough from the tree trunk and high enough off the ground that a climbing animal just can't reach it. You choose a limb that's not going to break. Scent carries. You must manage it. Plants. They also guide first aid when you're far from a clinic or a kit. Families used what grew near their camp, and they used it carefully. Sphagnum moss, that bright green, spongy moss, common in northern bogs. It's been used as an absorbent dressing for ages. It holds a ton of water, and it has a natural acidity that discourages some bacteria. Even records from later wars mention it being used as a field bandage. Spruce and pine pitch, that sticky resin. You warm it up, you thin it out, and it can seal small cuts, acting as a barrier to dirt. Willow bark, steeped in hot water, makes a bitter tea that many people used for aches and discomfort. Yarrow leaves. They were applied to help slow bleeding from small wounds. Plantain leaves. Those common flat-leafed weeds. You can crush them into a green mash, and they can cool the sting of an insect bite. Now, a big, important disagreement here. What is the strength and what are the risks of these practices? One position points to clear, observable benefits in some cases. Another position warns that plant identity and your individual reaction to that plant, they matter, and that heat, pressure, and cleanliness are your primary number one tools. Carry that second part with you. Clean a wound with boiled water that's been cooled to warm. Cover it. Rest if you can. Let these simple plant aids be a support, not a replacement for basic, modern caution. And finally, fats. Fats are not a decoration. They are dense, critical energy. Families saved every usable ounce. Marrow, knocked from long bones. Fats, rendered down gently in a pot, or even in a folded bark container, using hot stones. This gave them a reserve for when the hunting was lean. Nut oils, pressed by hand from pounded acorns or pine nuts. They added flavor, and they added calories to lean meat. Fish oil, from species that were rich in it, that was stored in skin bags and kept cool in the water. There is a quiet discipline here. You save fuel by rendering your fat in the residual heat of the fire after you're done cooking. You pour that fat into containers that have been lined or rubbed with a little clean ash to keep insects away. And then you store it cool. In your own practice, save your cooking oil in clean bottles. Tuck a small sealed one into your kit. I promise you, just 1 spoon of fat can turn a thin, watery broth into a meal. And the tools that make all of this possible, they are so simple and they're repairable. A digging stick, just a piece of hardwood, sharpened and then hardened in the flame of a fire. That's your shovel, and it does not break easily. A basket, woven from willow or roots. It carries your fruits and your greens without crushing them. A net, woven from plant fiber. It catches fish for you while you sleep, and you can mend it with a simple bone needle or just with your fingers. There is, of course, a debate about this. How early did certain weaving patterns spread across regions? Did some designs travel with families, or did they just arise in many places at once? The designs, they echo, because the needs echo. A tight weave on the bottom of a basket that's to hold small seeds. A looser weave on the sides that keeps the weight down. A rim wrapped carefully with a thicker root that stiffens the mouth so the basket will not sag when it's full. If you learn to split and smooth a root with your knife and maybe even your teeth, you learn how to make and fix 100 necessary things. But not every plant is your friend. This is critical. Many plants look alike, and a mistake can harm you. People avoided this by teaching their children the few foods that are always safe in their region, and they added more, slowly, as the children grew. They used time and place to narrow the risks. Fiddlehead ferns. They're eaten only when they're young and coiled, not when the leaves unfurl. Milkweed shoots. They're used at a particular height, not when that bitter latex dominates the plant. And mushrooms. Mushrooms were known, and they were named by families. Families with a culture that simply refused to guess. There's a disagreement among present-day enthusiasts about how far you should really go with mushrooms and complex plants in a true survival situation. One side urges extreme caution. They say, rely on the staples. Rely on the acorns, the roots you already know, and the greens you are 100% certain of. Another side argues for a broad, deep education, but both sides agree on this. Hunger is not the time to experiment. You learn now. You use only what you are absolutely positively certain of when it matters. Let's talk about something sweet. Sugar. Sugar is a steady mind and a steady body, especially when the cold and the work are grinding at you. In maple country, families would tap the trees in late winter, right when that sap begins to rise. The spires, the little spouts, they were made of sumac or other soft wood, hollowed out with a hot twig. They'd tap those into the tree, and it would carry the sap to a bark or a wooden container. Then, the boiling. Boiling reduces the volume, and it increases the sweetness until you have syrup, or, if you keep going, solid sugar. Birch sap, in more northern places, offered a lighter, thinner drink and a much thinner syrup. But it was still a gift of sugar from the trees. There's a debate about the tools, pre-contact tools versus the ones that were adopted after metal arrived. One position holds that efficient, large-volume pan boiling that became common with iron kettles. Another position notes that, no, families were making sugar long before that. They were using stone boiling in smaller batches, and that the practice was much older than the trade. Either way, the practice teaches patience. Sweetness arrives with slow heat and with attention. A small tin of sugar in your own pack. It does the same work today. And if you ever stand among maple trees in the late winter, you can gather just a small taste to remember what skill and season can make. Emergency foods. They exist, and they should be treated as exactly that, for emergencies. The inner bark from pine and other trees, there's a layer, the cambium, that you can scrape. You can eat it fresh, or you can dry it and grind it. It does not taste like a feast. It keeps you moving. But harvesting it poorly kills the tree. So, the ethical margin, the only way to do it, is to take a narrow strip from a fallen trunk or from a single living tree without girdling the whole circumference. The same is true for buds and needles, spruce tips. They taste bright and citrusy in the spring. They carry vitamins that a long winter diet lacks. You take a few, you leave many. If a spring storm strands you, a handful will lift you. But a grove that's been stripped bare by fear, that teaches nothing good, a story. A story these methods tell. It has less to do with heroics and more to do with pure judgment. Picture a woman. She's in a valley of oak and pine. It's the end of a long, dry summer. She has a child on her hip, and she's got a sack under her arm. Along a creek, she finds a patch of watercress, growing right where a cold spring is rising up through the gravel. She takes a little. She's careful not to muddy the roots. She walks to that sand basin, near the bend, and she spreads the acorn meal that she ground days ago. She pours water over it, slowly, and she watches it run clear. The child dozes. She takes older meal she's already leached. She shapes a thin cake, and she cooks it on a flat stone while she waits. She adds a few roasted pine nuts from a pouch. She eats. Then she gathers up the newly leached meal, and she ties it up. At dusk, she reaches her camp. Her partner has made a small rack, and he's hung strips of fish he caught in a simple weir set across a side channel. The smoke rises, blue and thin. They don't talk much. They just do the next task, and then the next. In the morning there will be food that needs no fire, even if the sky opens up. Another scene, this one from the cold country. A group is returning from a hunt. They have a caribou, quartered, and they have a basket of berries gathered along a muskeg edge. The children, they're carrying bundles of sphagnum moss. They're lining a shallow pit with bark. The meat that's not eaten fresh, it goes to a rack over a low, smoky fire. The fat, it renders slowly in a bark pot with hot stones. It's poured into skin bags. A woman mixes dried, pounded meat with that liquid fat. She presses it into bags. Pemmican. Another woman dries berries on mats for a day, and then she stirs them into a small batch of meat. That's for eating right away. They cache some of the food in that pit. They cover it, and they mark the place with a small sign that only they will recognize among all those thousands of hummocks. There's disagreement among scholars about the exact mixtures, the storage times across different nations. There is no disagreement about the reason. Winter is long. Skill is what turns a brief, lucky abundance into a line that crosses months. You can begin this right where you are, with what you have. Buy a small bag of raw acorns if oaks grow in your region. Learn to shell them and leach them and cook them on a weekend. Make a basket or even just a paper mock-up and go through the motions of winnowing rice or small grains in a gentle wind, just so your hands can learn how air carries chaff. Sew a small bag of cloth. Tie it with a cord you made by reverse wrapping fibers from weeds in a vacant lot. Dry apple slices near a small smoky fire in your backyard. Watch how that slow air and that thin fruit just change. Render a little fat from scraps in a pan. See how the gentle heat clears the impurities. Practice a snare trigger with a pencil and a piece of string on your table until your fingers just know it. Don't tell yourself stories about later. Build the habit now. Build the habit that will move through your arms without your permission on a day when a cold rain and a long mile have blurred all your choices. There is a grace in these modest foods that arrive without a big fight. A bowl of broth made from small fish and greens, a cake of acorn meal and berries, a handful of roasted seeds, a strip of meat dried to last, a cup of hot tea boiled with stones in a bark bowl. These are not less than the grand foods of a city. They are the right answer to a set of questions you will face if you walk far from doors and shops. They keep your muscles working, and they keep your mind even. They let you sleep with a full belly that doesn't demand fuel you cannot spare. The record that carries these methods, it's thick with specific names and specific places, and it's also simple enough to teach a child on a walk by a creek. When you leave your camp tomorrow, carry a food that does not require a fire, and carry a plan for a food that does. Know where you will gather an hour of calories if the sun drops faster than you expect. Keep a small store of sweetness to lift you at a low hour. Do not exhaust a patch. Name what you gather. Speak its season to yourself, so that your mouth and your mind remember it when you need it in a different place. You have learned to keep a coal alive in the rain. You've learned to build a roof that turns a chill into a rest. You've learned to read water and land until they answer you. And now you have learned to ask for food in a way that the place can afford to grant. That is how people before you moved across plains and deserts and forests, without maps and without stoves. And it is how you can move tomorrow, not as a test of your pain, but as a long, quiet conversation with a world that will feed you if you listen and if you respond in kind. So, a day that breaks clean and bright, that can still turn on you. A perfect blue sky can just close, like someone pulled a heavy lid over a pot. And the air, it can start to press on your skin in this weird, heavy way. A way that tells you the next few hours are going to cost you more than you planned. People who moved across big, open country, they survived by watching for the small signs. Because the small signs, they give you time. If you can predict a storm, even by just a little bit, you can choose a better route. You can gather a small dry stack of wood, and you can get your shelter made before the worst hour arrives. Over thousands of generations, families learn to read the wind. They learn to read the clouds and they learn to read the behavior of the animals that live out in the open. You can borrow that same reading. You can fit it to the places you travel. Let's start with the sky. You see those high, thin, wispy clouds? The ones that make a pale, ghostly ring around the sun or the moon? That's ice crystals, way up in the upper atmosphere. And that ring, that halo, it often comes before a big weather front. It's a sign that you'll probably see steady, soaking rain within a day. What about low, fast-moving scud clouds? Those little torn-up pieces that are zipping along under a higher, darker cloud deck. That just screams gusty weather. It's near. It's on you. A morning that starts weirdly warm and humid and still in a place that's usually breezy. That tells you a different story than a morning that starts crisp and clear with a moving wind. The smell of damp soil in the air when the ground is bone dry, that can mean the wind has swung around and it's now coming from a direction that carries moisture. Even insects tend to fly higher when the air pressure is high. They fly lower, closer to the ground when the pressure starts to fall. So a big swarm of gnats hanging low over a river at dusk, that can mean a change is coming in the night. Now, there's a disagreement among modern writers. How far can you really push these readings? Can you time it to the hour? One position says, look, these signals are reliable, in broad strokes. But they're going to vary a lot, based on your region and the season. Another position warns against getting overconfident. Your local topography, a big mountain or a canyon, it can bend the wind and it can make the cloud signs look different. The part you can keep, the practical part, is this. If you see that halo around the moon and you feel a soft wind turn into a steady wind from the south, you should probably plan to be under a roof you trust before dark. If the morning just feels wrong, deep in your bones, and the animals seem restless and agitated, don't make that the day you decide to push a risky, exposed ridge. Lightning and wind. They belong to a set of rules that do not change, just because you want them to. If you see a flash, and the thunder count reaches you fast, you choose the low line. You get off the highest glory point on that ridge. If you see clouds building into those huge, tall anvil towers, and the air tastes metallic, you do not stand up in a metal canoe in the middle of a lake. Families learn to tie their boats down, to pull them up on shore in a storm rather than just letting them batter against the rocks. They'd turn the hulls over and use them as windbreaks, and they'd keep their fires small until the air cleared. If you camp on a flat, sandy bar right under a tall riverbank and you see those thunderheads rising up canyon, you need to measure in your mind how high a sudden rise in water could reach. Storms that begin as wind, they can become flash floods without much warning. A simple move of just 20 steps to a slightly higher patch of ground that can be the difference between a wet morning and a truly dangerous night. Rivers and lakes, they are your roads, and they are your hazards, all at the same time. A person who knows how to cross water without a bridge, that person just has more choices. The first trick is to read the line of the river. Deep runs, they have a smoother, glacier surface with fewer ripples. Shallow riffles, they're broken by stones and they show small waves. In most places, a bend in the river, it digs deep on the outside and it leaves a shallow, gravelly bar on the inside. If you must ford the river, you look for a straight, wide, shallow reach with a firm bottom. and you use a staff. A good, solid staff turns your 2 legs into 3. You face upstream, and you cross at a slight diagonal downstream toward the far bank. You plant that staff into the current, and you step into the small, calm eddy it creates right behind it. And you unbuckle your pack. You unbuckle the hip belt and the sternum strap. Why? So you can shed that weight in an instant if you lose your footing. You do not want to be tied to a heavy, buoyant pack if you go under. And keep your boots on. They protect your feet way better than bare skin on a slick, sharp rock. There is a disagreement about this. If you're in a group, should you link arms? Or should you cross one at a time? One view says, yeah, a short rope between people, with each person also using a staff that spreads the load. It steadies everyone. Another view warns that if one person falls, they can take the whole group down, especially if that rope tangles. If you practice, choose your method with care, and use a light rope that you can release instantly. But never, never, ever step into the water above a strainer. That's a log or a tangle of branches that spans the river. If you fall, the current will take you under it, and it will hold you there. A canoe multiplies your distance, and the way a canoe is built, it teaches you the value of all these small skills, adding up to one strong craft. Birch bark canoes in the northeast and the north. They were frames of cedar ribs and planks, sewn to a hull of birch bark with split spruce root. And then they were sealed with spruce gum, mixed with a little fat or charcoal to keep it flexible. The bark. It was chosen in huge single sheets when the tree could spare it. It was peeled with respect and with skill, so the tree did not die. Seams were pierced with a bone awl, and they were laced without tearing. The planks, they'd carry that light smell of cedar, and they were ribbed, so the hull held its shape under strain. Dugouts, in the south and the northwest, they were carved from single logs, cedar, cottonwood, or other soft, stable woods. They were hollowed out using controlled fire and stone adzes. The trick was to keep the shell an even thickness and to leave strength along the keel. There's a disagreement in the written accounts about how often those really large, perfect bark sheets could be obtained without harming the trees, and whether, sometimes, bark hulls were just sewn from many smaller pieces as a matter of course. One position emphasizes that careful, seasonal harvest from older trees. Another notes that, patchwork hulls were probably pretty common, especially where good bark was less abundant. Whatever the form, the idea holds. A light boat, built with care, carries a family and all their food so much farther than a heavy craft that just wastes your effort. And if you don't build canoes, you can still learn the repair habits. Warm spruce gum or pine resin, mixed with a little bit of grease or fine charcoal, that makes a sealant that can close a seam on your boot. It can patch a hole in a bark container. It can stiffen a binding. A simple stitch through a torn corner and a smear of that gum that makes a weak place strong enough to carry the day. On the water, just a few strokes matter more than many powerful, sloppy ones. A J stroke on the paddle. That's the one where you turn the paddle into a small rudder at the end of your stroke. It lets you steer and go straight without having to switch sides every few seconds. A draw stroke, pulling the water toward you. It moves the canoe sideways, away from a rock, with one single, calm move, a brace, just slapping the flat of the paddle on the water, that keeps you upright when a wave slaps your hull from the wrong angle. These are not tricks for show. These are the moves that keep you dry. They keep you whole. And on a raft, one you built in a pinch, the same principles apply. You lash the logs with cord that runs in crosses. Then you twist those lashings with a stick, like a tourniquet, to cinch them down tight. You set cross poles to stiffen the whole raft, and you ferry at an angle. You let the current push you where you want to go, rather than trying to fight straight across it. You won't always want to get in the water, though. A simple, smart trick for crossing small inlets or mucky sloughs on foot. Find a V of brush, or a spot where the water cuts narrow, and just lay a small mat of tied-up brush, or a pad of saplings right there. You can weigh it down with stones. It makes a little step, a little bridge, that moves the water around it, while you move across it. Just don't trust it with your full, striding weight until you've tested it. Time is safety in these moves. People who lived by rivers, they didn't just crash through the channels. They probed, they placed their feet, and they kept their weight over their feet. There's a story from the Mackenzie River Basin of a woman who cut 3 poles, made a simple tripod. She laid a small square of brush between them, and she moved this little portable pad, step by step, across a peat bog. She kept her boots dry on a day when everything else was wet. Now, the tools for repair and for building on the move, they're light. They're light if you know what to make. Pitch glue. This is your all-purpose field epoxy. It's just resin from a pine or spruce, heated up and mixed with fine charcoal powder from your fire, and maybe a little bit of plant fiber, just to give it body. A tiny bit of beeswax, if you have it, softens the mixture so it doesn't crack when it gets cold. You warm this on a stick, you roll it into a small, hard cake, and that becomes a portable fix for everything. Seams, holes, fletchings on an arrow, hide glue. You make this from simmering connective tissue, scraps of hide. It sets up rock hard in dry weather, and it's perfect for tightening the bindings on your tools. Sinew. This is the fiber from the back straps of animals, like deer or elk. You dry it, and it splits into these incredibly fine, strong fibers. This is your thread. You wet it, so you can lay it flat and sew with it. And as it dries, it shrinks. It pulls your seam into this incredibly tight, waterproof stitch. And roots. Spruce root, willow shoots. You split them, you smooth them, you boil them. They make a lashing that doesn't cut into bark, and that holds up, even under heavy rain. There is a disagreement, of course, on the exact recipes for these pitch mixtures. One position favors a high charcoal mix for hardness. Another favors more resin and a touch of wax for flexibility. You know what? You can test this in your own backyard. Make 3 small cakes with different ratios. Patch a hole in an old scrap of cloth. Then flex it. Flex it in the cold. Flex it in the heat. See which one holds. Light. Light. After dark. It just extends your safety in a measured way. Stone lamps. Just a shallow, carved-out piece of soapstone filled with animal fat and a wick made of moss or plant fiber. These lamps warmed tents and houses in the Arctic for thousands of years. These lamps were tended carefully. You had to avoid smoke, and you had to manage the size of the flame. In the forests, you'd see torches a roll of birch bark, twisted up tight and bound with a root that gave you a quick, bright light for a short task. Pine knots, those dense, resin-soaked chunks of wood, they'd burn bright and hot when you split them and set them in a notch of green wood. Families did not light up the night for spectacle. They lit it to sew, to fix a tool, to check on a sleeping child. If you're in a pinch, a spoonful of oil and a strip of cloth, in a metal cup or a seashell, that will give you a quiet, steady light. Just balance the lamp so it cannot tip, and keep it away from your shelter walls. The trick is not to turn night into day. The trick is to bring just enough light to do one job well, and then to sleep, to give back what the day took from you. Biting insects. They can make a strong, calm person careless. People used smoke, and they used plants to keep insects at the edge of their camp, long before we had bottled repellents. A smudge. A smudge made of punky wood, or damp leaves, or certain grasses. You'd place that just upwind of your sleeping spot. It lowers the number of bites just by moving air through a steady ribbon of smoke. Cedar and spruce needles added to a small fire. They change the scent, and they keep the flies off your food for a time. Sweetgrass, burned in a braid, that was valued for its scent, and sometimes used this way. Bear fat or other oils mixed with fine white ash or with clay that made a paste. It dulled the bite of black flies, and it slowed them down. It made it harder for them to land. Some communities also used red ochre and grease, a coating that had both a social meaning and a very practical effect. There is a disagreement among modern sources. How effective are these plant smokes, really? Are they truly repelling, or are they just offering comfort? One view credits them with a clear, measurable benefit. Another says they help most when you combine them with mosquito nets and, most importantly, good site choice. Don't camp in a swamp. The habit you can keep is to make a small smudge, and to set your bed where the wind carries that thin smoke across you, not at you. Hygiene. Hygiene is not a luxury in the field. Clean hands and clean tools. They prevent the infections that can cost you days. People bathed in rivers and lakes when they could. They'd carry small bundles of aromatic plants to scrub and scent. Ash, just clean wood ash, with a little bit of fat, makes a simple, effective soap that lifts grease. Clay, dug from a clean riverbank. You can rub that on and rinse it off, and it pulls oil and grit from the skin. Teeth were picked. They were scrubbed with twigs and plant fibers. There are accounts of willow twigs, chewed on the end until they form a little brush, and then used with ash or a bit of salt to clean. Small wounds. They were washed. They were covered with clean moss or clean cloth, and they were checked. A cut on your foot. That is so much more dangerous than a cut on your wrist when you know you have to walk. The trick here is just attention. 10 minutes of quiet care each evening that can remove the seed of a week of trouble. Noise and scent. These affect your safety, especially in places where large animals move. In bear country, families hung their food from poles. They set their caches above ground, away from camp. They cooked where they would not sleep, and they cleaned their tools and their hands after. When they were traveling through dense, thick brush, they'd sing or they'd talk, just so that the animals heard them coming and moved. before that surprise turned into a test. In deer country, of course, the opposite was true. A still camp and quiet movement were prized. People ate away from their hunting blinds. They slept downwind of where they planned to hunt. There's some disagreement about how much specific plants, used as scent masks, really affected success. One position points to hunters rubbing yarrow or sage or cedar on their clothing to blend in. Another emphasizes that wind and stillness are the true arts. For your own safety, just adopt the clear, simple parts. Manage your food smells. Do not sleep where you just cooked a big, greasy meal. Make your presence known when a surprise would be dangerous. Keep your camp in a way that your own mind can rest. Knots and lashings. These are the things that carry so much more than just tents. A clove hitch, cast cleanly with one hand around a stake. It holds fast, but it unties easily. A timber hitch that grips a log when you pull on it, and it slips off when it's slack. It lets you move wood without fighting your rope. A square lashing. That's what binds two poles together at a right angle, in a way that builds frames fast. A diagonal lashing that stiffens a joint that wants to twist. People who wove and lashed things every single day, they did not think of knots as some separate, special knowledge. They just thought of them as the way. The way motion becomes structure. If you practice only 3 good knots, you can build almost anything you'll ever need. Practice them. Practice them until they just arrive in your hands, without you having to think. A knot that you tie with numb fingers in a high wind is not the same as one you tie at a warm table. You have to teach your hands before the storm. Ice. Ice can be a road, and ice can be a trap. Families in the north, they learn to listen to the language of snow and ice. A hollow boom from a lake after a cold, still night. That can mean the ice is thickening. That can mean safe travel. A soft sag under your foot where the snow looks perfectly level. That can hide a stream channel with thin ice just bridging it. Cornices. These form on the lee side of a ridge. That's the downwind side. The wind piles snow up into these beautiful, deadly overhangs that look just like solid ground. You step on a cornice, and it can break. Safe travel along a ridge means you keep your weight on the windward side, the side the wind is hitting, where the rock and solid ground are near. There is disagreement about how much the warning signs, those whumph sounds, or the shooting cracks in the snow, how much they really predict a slab avalanche. One position says, yeah, those are strong warnings. You listen to them. Another cautions that just because you don't hear them, that does not imply safety. For a traveler without formal avalanche training, the rule is simple. Avoid steep, open slopes of heavy snow. Avoid those warm, south-facing slopes as the day gets hotter. Take the trees. Stay in the trees, where the roots help hold the snow. If you must cross a slope you suspect, you spread your party out, you cross one at a time, and you keep your eyes on each person as they go. The trick is to avoid the situation in the first place, not to trust a sign that might not even appear. And if a day goes wrong, signals. Signals are what help those who come to help you. Smoke, seen from a distance. It's not as descriptive as you might hope. It blends in with low clouds on a still day. It gets tethered to the ground in an inversion. A signal mirror, or just a bright piece of metal flashed in the sun, that reaches so much farther. Families who got trade mirrors They learned to throw a flash of light through a V they made with their fingers. That's how they aimed the beam. At night, a small fire, placed where it cannot possibly run, and then fed in pulses. You cover it. You uncover it. That reads like a call. It doesn't look like just a camp. Sound. Sound carries a long way up valleys. 3 blasts on a whistle, separated by a pause. That's a modern convention. In some places. But older practice, in many communities, relied on known calls, on prearranged signs with their own family. There is disagreement in the old writings about whether a count of 3 was a universal distress sign, historically. One position says, no, the counts were local. Another sees patterns, especially along the trade routes. The safe habit for you is to just agree with your companions before you separate. Use a signal that you can repeat, even when you're under stress. But the mind is the tool. It's the tool that turns all these other tools into solutions, or not. People who walked long distances, they built mental routines to control their fear. When a plan had to change, they stopped. They named the problem in a single, clear sentence. The sun is setting, and we are not at the camp. This river is too high to cross. Then, they listed the moves they could make, with the light and the energy they had, and they always chose the certain act over the dramatic one. Here is a hard rule, a rule that kept travelers alive. You never spend the last of your light building a fire, if your roof is not yet certain. A bed and a roof without a flame that will beat a flame without a bed in a cold rain every single time. Here's another rule. You never let thirst make you walk past a place where you could get water, even if it takes an hour of work. You do not gamble on that spring around the corner. Not if you can dig in a dry wash, right here, and fill your bag right now. These are not secrets. They are the small, tough disciplines that make a hard day survivable. Let's use a story to pull these pieces together. You have 2 men and a woman. They're pushing down a prairie river in a light bark canoe. It's late spring. The banks are all clay, and the water is running brown and heavy. Low clouds are starting to boil up in the west. The woman, she's watching the swallows. They're cutting low, right over the water. Their wings are almost touching the surface. She notes that. The insects are flying low. She also sees that thin, pale ring around the Sunday. She says, "We should stop early." They pull the canoe over to the inside of a bend, where a stand of cottonwoods is. They lift the canoe, and they turn it over, to use as a roof, a windbreak. The men cut willow wands to make a quick frame, and they lay down mats of last year's dry grass. They set a small, long fire, small and steady. The woman, she warms up her little cake of spruce gum. She finds a seam on the canoe that was weeping, just a little, in the morning light. She patches it, softening the gum with a breath of heat, and rubbing in just a speck of charcoal. The storm arrives at dusk. It comes with a blast of wind and a solid grey line of rain. Lightning walks all across the prairie, but their camp is quiet. In the morning, the river has risen. It's full of debris. They wait an hour, just to let the worst of the edge pass. And then they ferry across, at an angle, with the current, rather than trying to fight a straight line across that heavy water. They move back into a river that will not push them into a cut, collapsing bank. Nothing in their day. Nothing. Looks like a stunt. It just looks like judgment. Another story, this one from the cold coast. A family is traveling on the sea ice, out to a seal hole. The father, he tests the ice with his staff at every single step, especially where the snow has drifted. The mother, she carries a small stone lamp tucked in a skin bag, wrapped to keep the oil from spilling. The child, he rides on a little sled at first, and then he walks. The boy asks, "Why does the wind sift the snow in that particular way?" The mother, she shows him. She shows him how the drift forms on the downwind side of a pressure ridge, and she points to a smooth, dark glaze on the ice. That, she says, marks a place where water rose up and then it refroze. They avoid the glaze. At the seal hole, the father sets up a small blind and he waits. Still, the mother, she makes tea on that tiny stone lamp. The wick is trimmed. The flame is turned low so the soot doesn't gather. The wind shifts. She smells salt, sharp and new. And she says, "A crack may be opening." They move. They move back to a line of old, thick pressure ice. Minutes later, a crack does open, right where they would have been standing. They did not run. They watched, and they went when the signs told them to. You can fit these lessons into a walk near your own home. You don't have to turn it into a test. Watch the sky for 1 week. Name 3 types of clouds each day, and then note how the weather changed. Practice throwing a signal flash on a sunny afternoon. See how far away your partner can see it. Tie a square lashing. Tie it with a good rope. And then tie it again with a strip of cloth that you've twisted into a cord. Heat a little bit of resin and mix it with fine charcoal from your own fire. Patch a hole in an old glove. See if it holds. Cross a shallow creek with a staff. Feel how that little eddy behind the wood supports your foot. Camp once with a small smudge upwind in a buggy place. Learn how to set it so the smoke just slides past you rather than smothering you. These are not hobbies. The land, it is not trying to trick you. It is just doing what it always does. The wind moves where the pressure tells it to. Water follows gravity, and it follows the paths it cut in floods years ago. Clouds build where the air lifts. Ice forms where cold and calm meet. Animals behave in ways that keep them alive. You are just stepping into this flow, and you are choosing to watch closer than most, if you do. A day that would have frightened you once. It just becomes a day that tests your practice. You don't own these old skills, you just repeat them. A person who can light a clean fire with wet, cold fingers, set a roof so the heat stays near the bed. Find water and make it safe. Gather and prepare food that doesn't fight the body, and read the sky and the water and the ice until the next hour feels more known. That person has taken on a set of tricks that they are not tricks at all. They're just a way to move through the world with less fear and with more respect. The rest of the work is just to keep walking and to keep watching until all those signals that once felt like riddles, they just become simple, plain statements. Statements that you answer with the next right move. That day, the one that breaks clean and bright, it can still turn. A blue sky can close just as if someone pulled a heavy lid over a pot. And that air, it can begin to press on your skin in a way that just tells you the next few hours are going to cost more than you planned. People who moved across big country, they watched for these small signs. Because small signs give you time. If you can predict a storm by just a little, you can choose a better route. You can gather that small stack of dry wood. You can make your shelter before the worst hour arrives. Over many, many generations, families learn to read the wind, the clouds, and the behavior of animals that live out in the open. You can borrow that reading. You can fit it to the places you travel. High, thin clouds, the ones that make a pale ring around the sun or moon, that means ice crystals in the upper air. That ring often comes before a front that will bring steady rain within a day. Low, fast-moving scud clouds under a higher, darker deck, that means gusty weather is near. A morning that starts warm and still, in a place that's usually breezy, tells a different story than a morning that starts crisp and moving. The smell of damp soil in the air, when the ground is dry, can mean the wind has swung from a direction that carries moisture. Insects. They fly higher with high pressure, and they drop lower when pressure falls. A swarm close to the ground along a river at dusk. That can mean a change in the night. There's disagreement among modern writers about how far you can push these readings to the hour. One position says the signals are reliable in broad strokes, but they vary by region and season. Another warns against overconfidence, because local topography, a big mountain or a canyon, it bends the wind and cloud signs. The part you can keep is practical. If you see that halo, and you feel a soft wind turn steady from the south, plan to be under a roof you trust before dark. If the morning just feels wrong, and animals seem restless, do not make that the day you push a risky, exposed ridge. Lightning and wind. They belong to a set of rules that do not change just because you want them to. If thunder counts reach you fast, you choose the low line, not the highest point on a ridge. If clouds build into those tall, flat-topped towers and the air tastes metallic, you do not stand in a canoe in the middle of a lake. Families learn to tie their boats down, pull them up on shore in a storm, rather than letting them batter against the bank. They turned the hulls over to make windbreaks. They kept their fires small until the air cleared. If you camp on a flat bar of sand, under a tall bank, and thunderheads rise up the valley, you measure in your mind how high a sudden rise in water could reach. Storms that begin as wind can become flash floods without much warning. A move of just 20 steps to a slightly higher patch of ground can mean the difference between a wet morning and a dangerous night. Rivers and lakes. They are roads, and they are hazards, all at once. A person who knows how to cross water without a bridge has more choices. The first trick is to read the line of the river. Deep runs have a smoother surface, fewer ripples. Shallow riffles are broken by stones and show small waves. In most places, a bend digs deep on the outside and leaves a shallow bar on the inside. If you must ford, look for a straight reach with a firm bottom, and use a staff. Turn your 2 legs into 3. You face upstream, and you cross at a slight diagonal downstream, placing the staff into the current and stepping into the small eddy it creates behind it. You unbuckle your pack, so you can shed it if you lose your footing. And you keep your boots on. They protect your feet better than bare skin on slick rock. There's disagreement about whether to link arms in a group or cross one at a time. One view says a short rope between people, with each person using a staff, spreads the load and steadies everyone. Another view warns that if one person falls, they can take everyone down if the rope tangles. If you practice, choose the method with care, and with a light rope you can release instantly, and never step into the water above a strainer, a log that spans the river. A strainer takes bodies under and holds them. A canoe. A canoe multiplies your distance, and the way it's built teaches the value of small skills adding up to a strong craft. Birch bark canoes in the northeast and north. They were frames of cedar ribs and planks, sewn to birch bark hulls with split spruce root. They were sealed with spruce gum, mixed with a little fat to keep it flexible. The bark was chosen in large sheets when the tree could spare it, peeled with respect and with skill, so the tree did not die. Seams were pierced with an awl and laced, not torn. The planks smelled of cedar and were ribbed so the hull held its shape under strain. Dugouts in the south and northwest were carved from single logs of cedar or cottonwood or other soft, stable woods. They were hollowed with controlled fire and with adzes. The trick was to keep the shell an even thickness and to leave strength along the keel. There's disagreement in the accounts about how often those large bark sheets could be obtained without harm, and whether bark was sometimes sewn from many smaller pieces as a matter of course. One position emphasizes careful harvest from older trees at the right season. Another notes that patchwork hulls were common, where good bark was less abundant. Whatever the form, the idea holds. A light boat, built with care, carries a family and their food much farther than a heavy craft that just wastes effort. And if you do not build canoes, you can still learn the repair habits. Warm spruce gum or pine resin, mixed with a little grease or charcoal, makes a sealant. It can close a seam on a shoe. It can patch a hole in bark. It can stiffen a binding. A stitch through a torn corner and a smear of gum makes a weak place strong enough to carry the day. On the water, a few strokes matter more than many. The J-stroke, that lets you steer and go straight without switching sides every few seconds. The draw stroke, that moves the canoe sideways from a rock with one calm move. The brace, that keeps you upright when a wave slaps your hull from the wrong angle. These are not tricks for show. They keep you dry and whole. On a raft you built in a pinch, the same principles apply. You lash the logs with cord that runs in crosses. You twist the lashings with a stick to cinch them tight. You set cross poles to stiffen the raft. And you ferry at an angle. You let the current push you where you want to go, rather than fighting straight across. You will not always want to enter the water. A simple trick for crossing small inlets or sloughs on foot is to find a V of brush where water cuts narrow. You lay a small mat of tied brush or a pad of saplings there. You weigh it with stones. It makes a step that moves water around it while you move across it. You just don't trust it with a full stride until you test it. Time. Time is safety in these moves. People who lived by rivers did not crash through channels. They probed, and they placed their feet, and they kept their weight over their feet. There is a story from the Mackenzie Basin of a woman who cut 3 poles as a tripod, laid a small square of brush between them, and moved this little portable pad, step by step, across a peat bog. She kept her boots dry on a day when all else was wet. Tools. Tools for repair and for building on the move are light, if you know what to make. Pitch glue. That's resin, heated and mixed with fine charcoal and a little plant fiber to give it body. A little beeswax added in small amounts softens the mixture so it does not crack when it's cold. You warm it on a stick, roll it into a small cake, and it becomes a portable fix. For seams, for holes, for fletchings. Hide glue, made from simmered connective tissue. It sets hard in dry weather. It can tighten the bindings on tools. Sinew, from the back straps of animals. It dries and splits into fibers that you twist into strong thread. You wet it to lay it flat and sew, and it shrinks as it dries into a tight seam. Spruce root and willow shoots, split, smoothed, and boiled. They make lashing that does not cut into bark, and that holds under rain. There is disagreement on the exact recipes for pitch mixtures across regions. One position favors a high charcoal mix for hardness. Another favors more resin and a touch of wax for flexibility. You can test this in your backyard. Make 3 small cakes with different ratios. Patch a hole in an old glove. Flex it in the cold and heat. See which one holds. Light after dark. That extends your safety in a measured way. Stone lamps, carved shallow and filled with animal fat and a wick of plant fiber. They warmed tents and houses in the Arctic. These lamps were tended carefully to avoid smoke and to manage the size of the flame. In forests, torches of birch bark, twisted or rolled and bound with root or cord, gave a quick light for a short task. Pine knots, rich in resin, burned bright when split and set in a notch of green wood. Families did not light the night for spectacle. They lit it to sew, to fix a tool, to check on a sleeping child. If you're in a pinch, a spoon of oil and a strip of cloth in a metal cup will give you a quiet light. You balance the lamp so it cannot tip. You keep it away from shelter walls. The trick is not to turn night into day. The trick is to bring just enough light, to do one job well, and then sleep. To give back what the day took. Biting insects. They can make a strong person careless. People used smoke and plants to keep insects at the edge of camp, long before bottled repellents. A smudge, made of punky wood, or damp leaves, or certain grasses. You place that upwind of your sleeping spot. It lowers the number of bites by moving air through a ribbon of smoke. Cedar and spruce needles added to a small fire change the scent. They keep flies off food for a time. Sweetgrass, burned in a braid, was valued for its scent, and sometimes used in this way. Bear fat, or other oils, mixed with fine ash or clay, that made a paste that dulled the bite of black flies and slowed their landing. Some communities also used red ochre and grease, a coating that had social meaning and a practical effect. There's disagreement among modern sources about how effective plant smokes themselves are at repelling insects versus just offering comfort. One view credits them with clear benefit. Another says they help most when combined with nets and good site choice. The habit you can keep is to make a small smudge and to set your bed where the wind carries that thin smoke across you, not smothering you. Hygiene. Hygiene is not a luxury in the field. Clean hands and clean tools prevent infections that cost days. People bathed in rivers and lakes when possible. They carried small bundles of aromatic plants to scrub and scent. Ash with a little fat makes a simple soap that lifts grease. Clay, lifted by hand from river edges, can be rubbed on and rinsed to pull oil and grit. Teeth were picked and scrubbed with twigs and plant fibers. There are accounts of willow twigs, chewed to a brush and used with ash or salt to clean. Small wounds were washed. They were covered with clean moss or cloth, and they were checked. A cut on a foot is more dangerous than a cut on a wrist when you must walk. The trick here is attention. 10 minutes each evening can remove the seed of a week of trouble, noise and scent. They affect safety. in places where large animals move. In bear country, families hung food from poles, or they set caches above ground, away from camp. They cooked where they would not sleep. They cleaned tools and hands after. Traveling through dense brush, they sang or spoke, so that animals heard them coming and moved before surprise turned into a test.